In the shadow of Mesopotamia's great ziggurats, there once stood a civilization that endured for over 2.5 millennia. While the names Babylon, Assyria, and Sumer echo through history textbooks, few people today have ever heard of Elam, despite the fact that this empire outlasted them all. How does a civilization that survived the rise and fall of a dozen Mesopotamian dynasties become so thoroughly forgotten? How did a people who once held the treasures of Hammurabi's Babylon in their mountain strongholds fade into historical obscurity? 5,000 years ago, while most of humanity still lived in small farming villages, something extraordinary was happening in the mountains and plains of what we now call Iran. In a region that would later be known as Elam, people were creating one of the world's first complex civilizations, and they were doing it at exactly the same time as their more famous neighbors in Mesopotamia. The story begins around 3200 BCE in the fertile plains of Khuzestan, where the Zagros Mountains meet the lowlands near the Persian Gulf. Here, the ancient city of Susa was emerging as something unprecedented, a true urban center with thousands of inhabitants, organized administration, and its own system of writing. While the Sumerians in nearby Mesopotamia were developing their cuneiform script, the proto-Elamites were independently creating their own method of recording information, a system so unique that scholars today still struggle to fully understand it. But Susa wasn't built in a day, and the path to civilization here followed a pattern that would define Elamite culture for millennia to come. Unlike the river valley civilizations that depended entirely on irrigation from major rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, the proto-Elamites built their society in a more diverse landscape. They controlled both the mountain valleys where precious metals and stones could be mined, and the lowland plains where grain could be grown. This geographic diversity would become one of their greatest strengths. The archaeological evidence from this period tells us a remarkable story. Excavations at Susa have revealed massive public buildings, sophisticated pottery, and thousands of clay tablets covered in the mysterious proto-Elamite script. These tablets appear to be administrative records, lists of goods, accounts of transactions, records of tribute or taxes. In other words, someone was running a complex economy that required detailed record-keeping. This wasn't a simple farming village anymore. This was a state. What makes the proto-Elamite achievement even more impressive is how quickly it happened. Around 3400 BCE, Susa was still a relatively small settlement. By 3100 BCE, it had become the center of what archaeologists call the proto-Elamite state, a political entity that controlled trade routes, administered resources, and maintained diplomatic contact with other emerging powers across the region. The proto-Elamite script itself provides tantalizing clues about how this early civilization organized itself. Unlike Sumerian cuneiform, which scholars have successfully deciphered, proto-Elamite remains largely mysterious. We can recognize some symbols, numbers, certain commodities like grain and livestock, what appear to be personal names or titles. But the grammar, the exact meanings, the full context of these records remain locked away, waiting for future breakthroughs in translation. What we do know is that this writing system was used across a vast area. Proto-Elamite tablets have been found not just at Susa, but at sites stretching from the Iranian plateau to the edges of Afghanistan. This suggests that whatever political or economic system the Proto-Elamites created, it had remarkable reach for such an early period in human history. The economy that supported this early state was impressively sophisticated. Archaeological evidence shows that proto-Elamite merchants were trading with communities hundreds of miles away. They imported lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, silver from Anatolia, and various luxury goods from across the Iranian plateau. They exported textiles, metalwork, and probably agricultural products from their fertile home region. This wasn't subsistence farming. This was an economy organized around surplus production and long-distance trade. Perhaps most intriguingly, the proto-Elamites seem to have developed their own distinctive approach to government and social organization. While we can't read their records in detail, the patterns of their administrative tablets suggest a system quite different from what we see in contemporary Mesopotamia. Their accounting methods, their ways of organizing information, even their artistic styles show clear differences from Sumerian practices. From the very beginning, the Elamites were charting their own course. The religious life of these early Elamites also shows signs of the distinctive character that would mark their civilization throughout its long history. Archaeological evidence suggests they worshipped deities connected to mountains, water, and fertility, gods and goddesses who reflected their diverse landscape of highlands and lowlands. While they certainly had contact with Mesopotamian religious ideas, they maintained their own spiritual traditions that would persist for thousands of years. By 3000 BCE, the foundations of Elamite civilization were firmly established. Susa had become a true city with monumental architecture, including what archaeologists believe was an early version of the ziggurat-style temples that would later become famous throughout the region. The proto-Elamite state controlled trade routes that connected the Iranian plateau with Mesopotamia and beyond. Most importantly, they had developed the administrative tools and political structures that would allow their civilization to adapt and survive through the rise and fall of countless neighboring empires. The success of proto-Elamite civilization rested on several key factors that would remain constant throughout Elamite history. First, their geographic position gave them control over crucial trade routes between the Iranian highlands and the Mesopotamian lowlands. Second, their diverse resource base made them less vulnerable to the kind of environmental disasters that could cripple river valley civilizations. Third, their administrative sophistication allowed them to organize resources and manpower on a scale that gave them real political power in regional affairs. But perhaps most importantly, the proto-Elamites had developed something that would serve them well in the centuries to come: adaptability. Their willingness to adopt useful innovations from neighbors while maintaining their own cultural distinctiveness would become a defining characteristic of Elamite civilization. They learned from the Sumerians without becoming Sumerian. They traded with distant peoples without losing their own identity. As the 3rd millennium BCE began, the proto-Elamite state centered at Susa found itself sharing the ancient world's stage with an increasingly powerful collection of city-states across the marshes and rivers of Mesopotamia. What followed would establish a pattern that would define the next 2.5 millennia. Elam and Mesopotamia locked in an endless cycle of competition, cooperation, and conflict that would outlast empires and reshape the ancient Near East. The Sumerian cities of Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu had been developing their own sophisticated civilizations at roughly the same pace as the proto-Elamites. By 3000 BCE, these city-states controlled the fertile river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, while Susa dominated the mountain passes and trade routes that connected the Iranian plateau to the wider world. It was inevitable that these two centers of power would eventually come into contact. And when they did, neither would ever be quite the same. The first interactions between Elam and Mesopotamia appear to have been primarily economic. Sumerian cities needed resources that their river valleys couldn't provide: metals for tools and weapons, precious stones for decoration and religious ceremonies, and exotic materials that could only be obtained from distant lands. The Elamites, with their control over mountain passes and trade networks stretching deep into the Iranian plateau, were perfectly positioned to supply these needs. Archaeological evidence from both regions shows a dramatic increase in trade goods during this period. Sumerian cities began receiving regular shipments of silver, copper, and tin from the Iranian highlands. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, and various precious stones from Central Asia flowed through Elamite-controlled trade routes into Mesopotamian markets. In return, the Sumerians exported grain, textiles, and finished goods, particularly the sophisticated pottery and metalwork for which their craftsmen were becoming famous. But this economic relationship was never simply peaceful commerce between friendly neighbors. The same geographic factors that made trade profitable also made conflict almost inevitable. Both civilizations wanted control over the trade routes that brought wealth and strategic resources. Both needed access to the borderlands where different ecological zones met and where the most valuable materials could be obtained. Most importantly, both were developing the military capabilities and political ambitions that would make them formidable rivals. The first recorded military conflicts between Elam and Mesopotamian powers date to around 2900 BCE, though the evidence comes primarily from Sumerian sources and must be interpreted carefully. Sumerian king lists and early inscriptions mention campaigns against the land of Elam and describe the capture of Elamite cities. These early conflicts seem to have been relatively small-scale affairs, raids and counter-raids rather than the massive campaigns that would characterize later periods. What's particularly interesting about these early conflicts is how they established patterns that would persist for centuries. Neither side ever achieved complete victory. The Sumerians might capture an Elamite city or force tribute payments, but they could never hold territory in the Iranian highlands for long. The Elamites might raid Mesopotamian settlements or disrupt trade routes, but they lacked the resources to conquer and hold the river valleys. Instead, both sides learned to view conflict as a normal part of their relationship, a way of adjusting the balance of power when one side became too dominant. The city-state of Uruk seems to have been particularly active in these early conflicts with Elam. Under rulers whose names have been lost to history but whose deeds were recorded in later Sumerian literature, Uruk launched several campaigns into Elamite territory. These expeditions appear to have had multiple objectives: capturing prisoners who could be used as laborers, seizing valuable goods and materials, and demonstrating Uruk's power to potential rivals and allies. The Elamites, for their part, proved remarkably adept at this new style of international politics. Rather than simply reacting to Sumerian initiatives, they began developing their own diplomatic and military strategies. Evidence suggests that Elamite rulers learned to play Sumerian city-states against each other, forming alliances with some cities while raiding others. This divide-and-conquer approach would become a cornerstone of Elamite foreign policy for the next 2 millennia. One of the most significant developments during this period was the gradual militarization of both civilizations. The need to defend against raids and to launch successful attacks of their own forced both Elamites and Sumerians to invest heavily in military technology and organization. Bronze weapons became more sophisticated, fortifications more elaborate, and armies more professional. What had begun as trading relationships between early cities was evolving into serious competition between emerging military powers. The cultural impact of these early interactions was equally important. Contact with Mesopotamian civilization exposed the Elamites to new ideas about government, religion, technology, and social organization. Sumerian concepts of kingship, legal codes, and urban planning influenced Elamite development. At the same time, Elamite ideas about mountain worship, metallurgy, and trade organization flowed back into Mesopotamian culture. But this cultural exchange was never simply one-way absorption. The Elamites consistently adapted foreign ideas to fit their own cultural patterns rather than simply copying Mesopotamian models. When they adopted Sumerian religious concepts, they integrated them with their own mountain deities. When they borrowed Mesopotamian governmental practices, they modified them to fit their own political traditions. This selective adaptation would become one of the keys to Elamite survival over the long term. By 2800 BCE, the relationship between Elam and Mesopotamia had settled into a pattern that would persist for centuries. Neither side could ignore the other, but neither could completely dominate their rival. Instead, they were locked in a complex dance of competition and cooperation that would shape the development of both civilizations. Trade continued to flow between the regions, bringing wealth and new ideas to both sides. But this trade was always conducted against a background of potential conflict. Merchants needed military escorts, trade routes required fortification, and commercial disputes could quickly escalate into military confrontations. The line between trade and warfare, between diplomacy and raiding, remained deliberately blurred. The Elamites had learned several crucial lessons during these early centuries of contact with Mesopotamia. First, they discovered that their geographic position gave them significant advantages in any prolonged conflict. Sumerian armies might raid into Elamite territory, but they couldn't sustain long campaigns in the mountains. Second, they realized that unity among Mesopotamian city-states was their greatest threat, while division among their neighbors was their greatest opportunity. Third, they understood that military strength alone wasn't enough. Successful competition with Mesopotamia required sophisticated diplomacy, economic strategy, and cultural adaptability. Around 2700 BCE, the proto-Elamite period that had characterized the previous 5 centuries was coming to an end. The mysterious script that had recorded the administrative activities of early Susa was disappearing, replaced by a modified version of Mesopotamian cuneiform that the Elamites adapted for their own language. But this change in writing systems reflected something far more significant: the emergence of the first historically documented Elamite royal dynasty, a line of kings whose names and deeds would be recorded for posterity and whose legacy would shape Elamite identity for over a millennium. The Awan dynasty, as later historians would call it, represented a fundamental transformation in how Elamite society organized itself. Where the proto-Elamite period had been characterized by city-states and regional centers operating with relative independence, the Awan kings created something new: a centralized monarchy that could unite the diverse peoples and territories of what we now call Khuzestan and Fars under a single royal authority. The first king whose name has survived in the historical record was Peli, though later Elamite king lists suggest there were earlier rulers whose names have been lost to time. Peli appears in Mesopotamian sources as a figure of considerable importance, someone whom Sumerian rulers treated as an equal rather than a mere local chieftain. This suggests that by his reign, the Elamite kingdom had achieved a level of political sophistication and military power that demanded respect from its Mesopotamian neighbors. But it was under King Tata, Peli's successor, that the Awan dynasty truly established itself as a regional power. Tata's reign marked a turning point in Elamite history because he was the first Elamite ruler to successfully coordinate large-scale military campaigns that extended Elamite authority far beyond the traditional heartland around Susa. Under his leadership, Elamite armies pushed into the Zagros Mountains to the north and east, bringing highland tribes under royal authority, while also establishing a stronger presence in the lowlands that bordered Mesopotamia. What made the Awan achievement particularly remarkable was the challenge of governing such a geographically and culturally diverse territory. The Elamite kingdom under the Awan dynasty included everything from the urban centers of the Khuzestan plain to pastoral nomadic tribes in the mountain valleys, from settled farming communities along the rivers to mining settlements in the highland regions where precious metals and stones were extracted. Creating a political system that could effectively govern such diversity required unprecedented administrative innovation. The Awan kings solved this challenge by developing what scholars now recognize as a distinctively Elamite approach to imperial governance. Rather than imposing uniform administrative structures across their entire territory, they created a flexible system that allowed different regions to maintain their traditional forms of local organization while accepting the ultimate authority of the Awan king. Highland tribes could keep their traditional chiefs as long as those chiefs acknowledged the king's supremacy and provided military service when required. Urban centers maintained their local assemblies and traditional legal practices while accepting royal appointees as overall governors. This approach to governance reflected a deeper understanding of political reality that would characterize Elamite statecraft for centuries to come. The Awan kings recognized that their kingdom's strength came not from rigid centralization, but from their ability to coordinate diverse resources and populations in pursuit of common goals. They understood that forced uniformity would create resistance and rebellion, while flexible accommodation could create genuine loyalty and cooperation. The military innovations of the Awan period were equally significant. The early Awan kings inherited the military traditions that had developed during the conflicts with Mesopotamian city-states, but they expanded and systematized these approaches to create what was probably the most effective military force in the ancient Near East at that time. Elamite armies under the Awan dynasty combined the mobility and toughness of highland warriors with the organizational skills and technological sophistication of lowland urban populations. Perhaps most importantly, the Awan military was organized around the principle of combined arms tactics that integrated different types of troops in coordinated battlefield operations. Elamite armies included light infantry recruited from mountain tribes who excelled at irregular warfare and raiding, heavy infantry from urban centers who could fight in organized formations, archers whose skills had been honed in hunting expeditions in the diverse landscapes of the kingdom, and early cavalry units that took advantage of the horses bred in the highland pastures. This military versatility gave the Awan kingdom significant advantages in conflicts with Mesopotamian powers, who typically relied on more standardized military formations that worked well in the river valleys, but struggled to adapt to the varied terrain where Elamite campaigns were often fought. When Sumerian armies invaded Elamite territory, they found themselves facing opponents who could shift seamlessly from conventional battlefield tactics to guerrilla warfare depending on the circumstances. The economic foundations of the Awan dynasty were built on the same principles of diversity and adaptability that characterized their political and military systems. The Awan kings inherited control over the trade routes that had made the proto-Elamite period prosperous, but they expanded and systematized this commercial network to create unprecedented wealth and economic power. Under Awan rule, Elamite merchants established permanent trading posts across the Iranian plateau and maintained regular commercial relationships with partners as far away as Central Asia and the Indus Valley. What distinguished Awan economic policy was the systematic way the royal government integrated different economic sectors to maximize the kingdom's overall prosperity. Highland regions provided metals, precious stones, and livestock. Lowland areas produced grain, textiles, and manufactured goods. The government coordinated production and distribution to ensure that each region's output complemented the others, creating an economic whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. The cultural achievements of the Awan period laid the foundation for a distinctive Elamite identity that would persist long after the dynasty itself had disappeared. The Awan kings patronized the development of a sophisticated artistic tradition that combined influences from Mesopotamia with indigenous Elamite elements and innovations borrowed from the many peoples who lived within their kingdom. Elamite craftsmen during this period created works in bronze, silver, and gold that displayed technical mastery equal to anything produced in contemporary Mesopotamia while maintaining distinctively Elamite aesthetic sensibilities. Religious developments during the Awan period were equally significant for the long-term development of Elamite civilization. The Awan kings systematically organized the various local religious traditions that existed throughout their territory into a coherent royal cult that served to legitimize their authority while respecting local spiritual practices. They identified their own royal patron deities with the traditional gods and goddesses worshipped in different parts of the kingdom, creating a religious synthesis that reinforced political unity without suppressing local traditions. By the end of the Awan period, around 2200 BCE, the kingdom they had created had fundamentally transformed the political landscape of the ancient Near East. The Elamite kingdom was now recognized as one of the major powers of its time, capable of treating with Mesopotamian rulers as an equal and possessing the military, economic, and administrative resources necessary to maintain its independence against any likely threat. Around 2350 BCE, everything the Awan dynasty had built to secure Elamite independence suddenly faced an unprecedented threat. In the Mesopotamian city of Akkad, a ruler named Sargon was creating something the ancient world had never seen before. A true empire that would unite all of Mesopotamia under a single crown and project its power far beyond the traditional boundaries of civilized warfare. For the Elamites, who had successfully managed relationships with individual Sumerian city-states for centuries, the rise of Akkadian imperial power represented a challenge that would test the very foundations of their political system. Sargon's revolution wasn't simply a matter of one city conquering its neighbors. What made the Akkadian Empire fundamentally different from anything that had come before was its systematic approach to conquest and control. Where Sumerian city-states had fought limited wars for specific objectives, tribute, prisoners, or temporary dominance, Sargon created a military and administrative machine designed for permanent conquest and integration of foreign territories. His armies didn't just raid and withdraw. They conquered, occupied, and incorporated. The Akkadian military system that Sargon developed represented a quantum leap in the technology and organization of warfare. Akkadian armies were larger than anything the Elamites had previously faced, numbering in the thousands rather than hundreds. They were equipped with standardized bronze weapons produced in royal workshops rather than the varied equipment that characterized earlier military forces. Most importantly, they were organized as a permanent, professional force loyal to the king personally, rather than temporary levies raised from local populations for specific campaigns. When Sargon turned his attention toward Elam around 2330 BCE, the Awan kings discovered that their traditional strategies for dealing with Mesopotamian threats were inadequate for this new reality. The flexible defensive tactics that had worked so well against Sumerian city-state armies proved insufficient against Akkadian forces that could sustain long campaigns, maintain supply lines across hostile territory, and coordinate multiple simultaneous operations across a broad front. The first Akkadian campaigns into Elamite territory revealed the extent of the challenge facing the Awan dynasty. Sargon's armies didn't simply raid border settlements and withdraw, as Sumerian forces had done for centuries. Instead, they systematically conquered Elamite cities, installed Akkadian governors, and established permanent garrisons to maintain control. The ancient city of Susa itself, the heart of Elamite power for over a millennium, fell to Akkadian forces and was incorporated into Sargon's expanding empire. But the conquest of Susa represented more than just a military defeat for the Elamites. It marked the first time in their recorded history that foreign rulers had successfully imposed direct administrative control over the Elamite heartland. The Akkadians didn't simply demand tribute or acknowledgement of supremacy. They replaced Elamite officials with their own appointees, imposed Akkadian legal codes, and required that Elamite resources be integrated into the broader imperial economy. The Elamite response to Akkadian conquest revealed both the strengths and limitations of the political system the Awan dynasty had created. In the lowland regions around Susa, where Akkadian control was most direct and effective, Elamite resistance was initially limited. The urban populations that had prospered under Awan rule found themselves faced with a choice between accommodation and destruction, and many chose to work within the new Akkadian system rather than risk everything in hopeless resistance. However, in the highland regions where Awan authority had always been more flexible and indirect, the Akkadian conquest proved much more difficult to consolidate. Mountain tribes that had acknowledged Awan supremacy while maintaining their traditional autonomy were far less willing to accept direct Akkadian rule. The same geographic factors that had made these regions difficult for the Awan kings to control now worked against the Akkadians, who found themselves trying to govern populations that could easily retreat into mountain strongholds when imperial authority became too oppressive. The reign of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, marked the height of Akkadian power and the lowest point of Elamite independence. Naram-Sin declared himself a god and demanded worship from his subjects, a level of imperial presumption that went far beyond anything previous Mesopotamian rulers had attempted. Under his rule, Akkadian control over Elamite territory became more systematic and oppressive, with imperial officials extracting ever larger quantities of tribute while showing little regard for local traditions or needs. But Naram-Sin's imperial ambitions also revealed the fundamental weakness of the Akkadian system. The empire had grown too large and diverse to be effectively governed by the centralized administrative methods that had worked for smaller territories. Rebellions broke out across the empire as subject populations grew tired of Akkadian exploitation, and the imperial government found itself fighting simultaneous conflicts on multiple fronts. For the Elamites, these rebellions provided opportunities to begin rebuilding their independence. Elamite leaders who had been forced underground during the initial Akkadian conquest began coordinating resistance activities with rebels in other parts of the empire. They learned to time their uprisings to coincide with Akkadian difficulties elsewhere, maximizing the pressure on imperial forces while minimizing the risk of overwhelming retaliation. The Elamite resistance during this period developed new forms of political and military organization that would influence their society for centuries to come. Unable to maintain the centralized royal authority that had characterized the Awan period, Elamite leaders created networks of cooperation between different regions and communities that were more flexible and harder for foreign powers to disrupt. These networks combined traditional tribal loyalties with urban commercial interests and highland military capabilities to create a form of resistance that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the experience of Akkadian conquest taught the Elamites crucial lessons about the nature of imperial power and the strategies necessary for long-term survival. They learned that military resistance alone was insufficient against enemies with superior resources and organization. Instead, successful resistance required patient political work to build coalitions, careful timing to take advantage of imperial weaknesses, and the ability to shift between different forms of opposition depending on circumstances. The Elamites also learned to use the Akkadian Empire's own success against it. As the empire grew larger and more diverse, its administrative systems became more complex and harder to coordinate. Elamite resistance leaders became expert at exploiting these weaknesses, creating problems that forced the Akkadians to divert resources from other priorities while carefully avoiding provocations that might trigger massive retaliation. By 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire was beginning to show serious signs of strain. Climate change was reducing agricultural productivity across Mesopotamia, making it harder to support the large armies and administrative apparatus that imperial control required. Rebellions were becoming more frequent and more difficult to suppress. The empire that had seemed invincible under Sargon and Naram-Sin was starting to crack under the weight of its own ambitions. For the Elamites, these developments created opportunities to begin rebuilding their independence, but they also posed new challenges. The collapse of Akkadian power would create a political vacuum in the region, and multiple groups would compete to fill it. The Elamites would need to move quickly and decisively to re-establish their control over their traditional territories before other powers could claim them. The experience of Akkadian conquest had fundamentally changed Elamite society in ways that would persist long after imperial control ended. The old Awan system of flexible royal authority over diverse populations had been broken, and something new would need to take its place. The next phase of Elamite history would be shaped by the lessons learned during these difficult centuries and by the innovations in political organization that resistance to Akkadian rule had made necessary. As Akkadian power continued to weaken, the stage was set for a new chapter in Elamite history, one that would see the emergence of the Shimashki dynasty and a renewed assertion of Elamite independence. Around 2100 BCE, as the Akkadian Empire finally collapsed under the weight of its overextended commitments and internal rebellions, the Elamites found themselves presented with an unprecedented opportunity. For the first time in over 2 centuries, no single Mesopotamian power dominated the region, and the political vacuum left by Akkadian withdrawal created space for new powers to emerge. The Elamite response to this opportunity would establish the Shimashki dynasty as one of the most successful royal houses in ancient Near Eastern history and restore Elam to its position as a major regional power. The transition from Akkadian rule to Elamite independence didn't happen overnight, nor was it accomplished through a single dramatic military victory. Instead, the process unfolded gradually as Akkadian control weakened and Elamite leaders carefully rebuilt their political and military capabilities. The new dynasty that emerged from this process took its name from the city of Shimashki, located in the highland regions of Fars that had served as a center of resistance during the Akkadian period. The choice of Shimashki as the new dynastic center reflected important changes in how Elamite society had reorganized itself during the centuries of foreign domination, where the Awan dynasty had been centered in the lowland city of Susa and had focused on controlling the trade routes between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. The Shimashki kings established their power base in the highlands and emphasized military strength over commercial wealth. This shift in focus would prove crucial to their success in the changed political environment of the post-Akkadian world. The first significant ruler of the Shimashki dynasty was Kindatu, whose reign marked the beginning of systematic Elamite efforts to reclaim territories that had been lost to Akkadian conquest. Kindatu understood that the collapse of Akkadian power had created opportunities not just for Elamite resurgence, but for the emergence of new Mesopotamian powers that might prove even more dangerous than the Akkadians had been. His strategy focused on rapid expansion to establish Elamite claims to disputed territories before potential rivals could organize effective opposition. Kindatu's military campaigns revealed how much Elamite warfare had evolved during the period of Akkadian domination. The resistance networks that had developed during the occupation had created new forms of military organization that combined traditional Elamite strengths with lessons learned from observing Akkadian methods. Shimashki armies were larger and better organized than those of the Awan period, but they retained the flexibility and adaptability that had always characterized Elamite military culture. The most significant challenge facing the Shimashki dynasty came not from the scattered remnants of Akkadian power, but from a new Mesopotamian state that was emerging in the south. The third dynasty of Ur, known to historians as Ur-Thrd, was creating a centralized administrative system that in many ways surpassed even Akkadian achievements in efficiency and control. Under rulers like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, Ur-Thrd was expanding northward and eastward, bringing it into direct conflict with Elamite territorial claims. The conflict between the Shimashki dynasty and Ur-Thrd represented more than just a territorial dispute between neighboring powers. It was a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to political organization and imperial control. Ur-Thrd represented the perfection of Mesopotamian administrative techniques, with standardized legal codes, systematic taxation, and detailed record-keeping that allowed unprecedented central control over subject populations. The Shimashki system, by contrast, maintained the traditional Elamite emphasis on flexible accommodation of local differences within an overall framework of royal authority. Idadu-Napir, who succeeded Kindatu as the leading Shimashki ruler, proved particularly adept at exploiting the tensions inherent in the Ur-Thrd system. Where Ur-Thd's strength lay in its administrative efficiency, its weakness lay in the rigidity that such efficiency required. Elamite military and diplomatic strategies under Idadu-Napir focused on creating problems that the Ur-Thrd system couldn't easily solve. Raids that disrupted administrative schedules, alliances with populations that resented Ur-Thrd control, and diplomatic initiatives that forced Ur-Thrd to choose between competing priorities. The relationship between Elam and Ur-Thrd was further complicated by the presence of independent Mesopotamian city-states that maintained their autonomy despite the expansion of both empires. The city of Lagash, under its ruler, Gudea, managed to maintain independence from Ur-Thrd control while developing profitable commercial relationships with both Elamite and Mesopotamian powers. Gudea's success in balancing these competing relationships provided a model for smaller powers throughout the region and demonstrated that skillful diplomacy could sometimes achieve what military force could not. Elamite relations with independent cities like Lagash revealed the sophistication of Shimashki diplomatic strategy. Rather than simply demanding submission or attempting conquest, the Shimashki kings developed a network of alliances and commercial partnerships that gave them influence throughout Mesopotamia, without requiring the massive military commitments that direct conquest would have demanded. This approach allowed them to project power far beyond their actual territorial control, while avoiding the overextension that had ultimately doomed the Akkadian Empire. The economic foundations of Shimashki power reflected the dynasty's highland origins and military focus. Where the Awan kings had built their wealth primarily on trade, the Shimashki rulers emphasized the development of metallurgical industries and mining operations in the Zagros Mountains. The superior quality of Elamite metalwork, particularly in bronze and precious metals, gave them significant advantages in both military equipment and diplomatic gift-giving that helped compensate for their smaller population base compared to Mesopotamian powers. Agricultural development under the Shimashki dynasty also reflected their highland perspective. Rather than focusing exclusively on the irrigation agriculture that dominated Mesopotamian thinking, Shimashki agricultural policy emphasized the development of highland farming techniques that could make productive use of the diverse microclimates found in mountainous terrain. This approach not only increased overall agricultural productivity, but also made the Elamite economy less vulnerable to the climate fluctuations that could devastate lowland irrigation systems. The religious policies of the Shimashki dynasty played a crucial role in legitimizing their authority and uniting the diverse populations under their control. The Shimashki kings systematically promoted cults associated with mountain deities and highland religious traditions, creating a distinctly Elamite religious identity that contrasted sharply with the lowland religious practices of their Mesopotamian rivals. This religious emphasis on highland traditions helped reinforce Elamite cultural distinctiveness while providing spiritual justification for resistance to foreign domination. Cultural developments during the Shimashki period laid the groundwork for many of the artistic and intellectual achievements that would characterize later Elamite civilization. Shimashki royal patronage supported the development of distinctive Elamite artistic styles that combined traditional motifs with innovations influenced by contact with various Mesopotamian traditions. The result was a cultural synthesis that was recognizably Elamite while demonstrating sophisticated awareness of broader regional developments. By the end of the 21st century BCE, the Shimashki dynasty had successfully re-established Elam as a major regional power capable of competing with any Mesopotamian state on equal terms. Their territorial control extended from the Persian Gulf to the central Zagros Mountains. Their military forces were among the most effective in the ancient Near East, and their diplomatic influence reached throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. But the very success of the Shimashki resurgence had also created new tensions and opportunities that would shape the next phase of Elamite history. The growth of Elamite power had attracted the attention of Ur-Thrur, which was reaching the peak of its own expansion and administrative development. The collision between these two imperial systems was becoming inevitable, and when it came, it would determine the future balance of power throughout the ancient Near East. The year 2004 BCE marked one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in ancient Near Eastern history. In a single devastating campaign, the mighty Third Dynasty of Ur, the most sophisticated administrative state the world had yet seen, collapsed under a coordinated assault that brought together Elamite military power, Amorite tribal forces, and Mesopotamian political opportunism. At the center of this historic catastrophe stood Kindatu, the Shimashki king who transformed Elam from a defensive highland power into an aggressive military force capable of toppling the greatest empire of its age. The roots of Ur's destruction lay in the very administrative efficiency that had made Ur III so powerful. The centralized system that Shulgi and his successors had perfected required enormous resources to maintain, and by the early 21st century BCE, the burden of supporting the imperial bureaucracy was straining the economic foundations of the state. Increased taxation to fund the administration created resentment among subject populations, while the rigid administrative procedures that ensured efficiency also reduced the government's ability to respond flexibly to unexpected challenges. Kindatu recognized these structural weaknesses and began developing a strategy that would exploit them systematically. Rather than challenging Ur-3 directly through conventional military confrontation, he chose to orchestrate a coordinated campaign that would attack the empire's foundations simultaneously from multiple directions. This approach required sophisticated diplomatic preparation and careful timing, but it promised results that no single military campaign could achieve. The key to Kindatu's strategy was his alliance with the Amorite tribes that had been pressuring Mesopotamian settlements from the west. The Amorites were semi-nomadic peoples whose traditional lifestyle was increasingly incompatible with the settled agricultural civilization that Ur-III represented. Population pressure and climate change had intensified Amorite migration into Mesopotamian territory, creating conflicts that the Ur-III administrative system was poorly equipped to handle. Previous Mesopotamian rulers had typically dealt with Amorite pressure through a combination of military campaigns to drive them back and diplomatic efforts to co-opt individual tribal leaders. Kindatu's innovation was to offer the Amorites something that no Mesopotamian power could provide: a coordinated strategy for overturning the entire system that restricted their movement and threatened their traditional way of life. The alliance between Kindatu and the Amorite tribes represented more than just a military partnership. It was a meeting of two fundamentally different approaches to political organization that found common ground in their opposition to Ur-III's rigid administrative control. The Amorites brought mobility, numbers, and intimate knowledge of Mesopotamian weaknesses. The Elamites contributed organizational skills, siege warfare capabilities, and the political vision necessary to transform military success into lasting change. The campaign that culminated in the sack of Ur began not with a direct assault on the capital, but with a series of coordinated attacks designed to isolate the city and undermine the imperial administration's ability to respond effectively. Elamite forces struck at key administrative centers in the eastern provinces, disrupting the flow of tribute and communications that kept the imperial system functioning. Simultaneously, Amorite tribes launched raids throughout the western territories, forcing Ur-III armies to disperse their forces across multiple fronts. As the imperial administration struggled to coordinate responses to these multiple threats, Kindatu introduced a new element into his strategy: political subversion within Mesopotamia itself. Working through networks of merchants and local officials who had grown frustrated with Ur-III policies, Elamite agents encouraged defections and rebellions in cities throughout the empire. The most significant of these defections came from Ishbi-Era, the governor of Isin, who declared his independence from Ur and began establishing his own territorial control in central Mesopotamia. Ishbi-Era's defection was particularly damaging to Ur-III because it came from within the administrative elite that was supposed to be the regime's most reliable support. As a former imperial official, Ishbi-Era understood the weaknesses of the Ur-III system intimately, and his rebellion provided a model for other ambitious governors who saw opportunity in the empire's difficulties. More immediately, his control of Isin blocked the main route between Ur and the northern provinces, making it nearly impossible for the imperial government to coordinate military responses to the various threats it faced. The final assault on Ur itself demonstrated the military innovations that the Shimashki dynasty had developed during their resurgence period. Elamite siege techniques had advanced considerably since the Awan period, incorporating lessons learned from observing Akkadian and Ur-III military methods. The Elamite army that approached Ur's walls was equipped with sophisticated siege engines, organized in coordinated tactical units, and supported by engineering specialists who understood how to overcome the massive fortifications that protected the city. But the sack of Ur was not simply a military triumph. It was also a carefully orchestrated political statement. Kindatu's forces captured not just the city, but also its last king, Ibbi-Sin, along with the royal family and the most important religious and administrative officials. This comprehensive capture of the imperial leadership sent a clear message throughout the region. The age of Ur-III dominance was definitively over, and new powers would determine the future political order. The treatment of the captured Ur-III leadership revealed the sophistication of Elamite political thinking. Rather than simply executing his prisoners or demanding enormous ransoms, Kindatu used them as diplomatic assets in the complex negotiations that followed the fall of Ur. Some officials were returned to their home cities as governors loyal to Elam. Others were held as hostages to ensure the cooperation of their relatives and followers, and still others were integrated into the Elamite administrative system, where their expertise could benefit their new masters. The wealth captured during the sack of Ur transformed the economic foundations of the Shimashki dynasty. The Ur III treasury contained not just precious metals and luxury goods, but also the administrative records that documented tribute obligations, trade relationships, and territorial claims throughout Mesopotamia. This information proved invaluable in establishing Elamite authority over former Ur III territories and in negotiating with the various powers that emerged in the aftermath of the empire's collapse. Perhaps most significantly, the sack of Ur marked a fundamental shift in Elamite strategic thinking from defensive to offensive approaches to regional politics. For over 5 centuries, Elamite strategy had focused primarily on maintaining independence against Mesopotamian expansion. The destruction of Ur demonstrated that Elam was now capable of taking the initiative in regional conflicts and imposing its will on Mesopotamian affairs. The international consequences of Ur's fall extended far beyond the immediate region. The collapse of the most powerful state in the known world sent shockwaves throughout the ancient Near East, encouraging rebellions and power struggles from the Levant to the Iranian plateau. Kings and city-states that had accepted Ur III's dominance suddenly found themselves free to pursue their own ambitions, while new powers emerged to fill the vacuum left by imperial collapse. For the Amorite tribes who had been Kindatu's allies in the conquest, the fall of Ur opened opportunities for large-scale settlement in Mesopotamian territory. Over the following decades, Amorite dynasties would establish themselves in cities throughout the region, fundamentally changing the ethnic and cultural composition of Mesopotamian civilization. The most famous of these Amorite kingdoms would eventually produce Hammurabi of Babylon, whose law code would become one of the most important documents in human legal history. The religious implications of Ur's destruction were equally profound. The city had been not just a political capital, but also a major religious center, whose patron deity, the moon god Nana, was worshipped throughout Mesopotamia. The capture of Ur's religious treasures and the disruption of its cult practices sent a powerful message about the changing balance of divine favor in the region. As news of Ur's fall spread throughout the ancient world, it became clear that the Shimashki dynasty had achieved something unprecedented in Elamite history. For the first time, an Elamite king had not merely defended his territory against Mesopotamian aggression, but had actually conquered and destroyed a major Mesopotamian power. This achievement established Elam as the dominant military force in the region and created opportunities for expansion that would define the next phase of Elamite imperial development. The decades following the spectacular destruction of Ur transformed the Elamite kingdom from a highland military power into something unprecedented in the ancient world. A sophisticated imperial state organized around principles of shared leadership that differed fundamentally from the autocratic models that dominated Mesopotamian political thinking. The governmental system that emerged during this period, known to historians as the Sukkalmah system, represented one of the most innovative approaches to imperial administration in ancient history and would define Elamite political culture for the next 4 centuries. The term Sukkalmah translates roughly as Grand Regent or Great Messenger, but these simple translations fail to capture the complexity of the political role that this title represented. Unlike traditional Near Eastern kingship, which concentrated all authority in a single ruler who claimed divine mandate for absolute power, the Sukkalmah system distributed royal authority among multiple rulers who governed different aspects of the kingdom through carefully balanced relationships of cooperation and competition. The origins of this unique system lay in the practical challenges of governing the expanded territories that Kindatu's victories had brought under Elamite control. The destruction of Ur-3 had left the Shimashki dynasty in control of vast territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the central Zagros Mountains, encompassing dozens of cities, numerous tribal groups, and populations with widely varying traditions of law, religion, and social organization. Traditional autocratic kingship, which had worked adequately for the more limited territories of earlier Elamite dynasties, proved inadequate for managing such diversity on an imperial scale. The first ruler to hold the title of Sukkalmah was Eparti II, who came to power around 1900 BCE as the grandson of Kindatu through a complex succession process that itself reflected the collaborative principles that would characterize the new system. Rather than simply inheriting absolute authority as traditional kings did, Eparti was chosen through consultations among the leading families of the Shimashki dynasty and was required to share power with relatives who held complementary titles and governed specific regions or functions within the kingdom. Under Eparti's Sukkalmah system, the Elamite kingdom was governed by three principal rulers operating in carefully defined spheres of authority. The Sukkalmah himself served as the supreme ruler and military commander, responsible for foreign policy, major military campaigns, and the overall coordination of imperial policy. The second position, known as the Sukkal of Elam and Shimashki, governed the core territories of the kingdom and served as the primary administrator for domestic affairs. The third position, the Sukkal of Susa, controlled the ancient capital and its surrounding regions while serving as the kingdom's principal religious authority. This division of authority was far more than a simple administrative convenience. It represented a sophisticated understanding of the different types of expertise required for effective imperial governance, and a recognition that no single individual could master all the skills necessary for managing such a complex political entity. Military leadership required different talents than religious administration, and both differed from the detailed knowledge of local customs and conditions necessary for effective domestic governance. The genius of the Sukkalmah system lay in how it balanced cooperation and competition among the three principal rulers. While each had clearly defined spheres of authority, many important decisions required consultation and agreement among all three, creating a system of checks and balances that prevented any single ruler from accumulating excessive power. At the same time, the overlapping responsibilities and shared interests created incentives for cooperation rather than destructive competition. Shilhaha, who succeeded Eparti as Sukkalmah around 1850 BCE, further refined the system by institutionalizing the consultation processes that had developed informally during his predecessor's reign. Under Shilhaha's reforms, major policy decisions had to be approved by formal councils that included not only the three principal rulers, but also representatives from important cities, tribal leaders, and religious authorities throughout the kingdom. This consultative approach ensured that imperial policies took account of local conditions and concerns while maintaining the central coordination necessary for effective governance. The administrative innovations of the Sukkalmah period extended far beyond the royal court to encompass the entire structure of imperial government. Traditional Mesopotamian administrative systems relied heavily on royal appointees who served at the pleasure of the king and were expected to implement policies developed at the imperial center. The Elamite system, by contrast, created formal roles for local leaders and traditional authorities within the imperial administration, allowing them to maintain their traditional functions while integrating them into the broader imperial system. This approach to administration had several important advantages over more centralized systems. It reduced the costs of imperial governance by utilizing existing local administrative structures rather than replacing them with expensive royal bureaucracies. It increased the legitimacy of imperial authority by working through leaders whom local populations already recognized and respected. Most importantly, it created flexibility that allowed the imperial government to adapt policies to local conditions rather than imposing uniform standards that might be inappropriate for specific regions or communities. The economic policies of the Sukkalmah period reflected the same principles of diversity and adaptation that characterized their political innovations. Rather than attempting to standardize economic activities throughout their territories, The Sukkalmahs developed policies that maximized the economic potential of each region, while integrating local production into kingdom-wide networks of trade and resource distribution. Highland regions continued to specialize in metallurgy and mining. Lowland areas focused on agriculture and textile production, and urban centers served as manufacturing and commercial hubs that coordinated economic activities across regional boundaries. The religious policies of the Sukkalmah period were particularly innovative in their approach to managing the diverse spiritual traditions found throughout the Elamite kingdom. Rather than imposing a single royal cult or attempting to suppress local religious practices, the Sukkalmahs developed a synthetic approach that recognized local deities while integrating them into a broader pantheon headed by distinctively Elamite gods and goddesses. This religious synthesis allowed local communities to maintain their traditional spiritual practices while participating in kingdom-wide religious festivals and ceremonies that reinforced imperial unity. Siwe Palar Hupak, who served as Sukkalmah during the mid-18th century BCE, demonstrated the military effectiveness of the new governmental system through successful campaigns that extended Elamite influence deep into Mesopotamian territory. His armies conquered the city of Eshnunna and established Elamite control over important trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Iranian plateau. These military successes were possible because the Sukkalmah system allowed for more efficient coordination of resources and manpower than traditional autocratic systems could achieve. The cultural achievements of the Sukkalmah period reflected the cosmopolitan character of the governmental system that sponsored them. Elamite artists and craftsmen during this period created works that demonstrated sophisticated awareness of artistic traditions from throughout the ancient Near East while maintaining distinctively Elamite aesthetic sensibilities. The royal workshops established by the Sukkalmahs produced metalwork, textiles, and ceremonial objects that rivaled anything created in contemporary Mesopotamian or Egyptian courts. Legal developments under the Sukkalmah system were equally significant for the long-term evolution of Elamite civilization. The need to govern diverse populations with different legal traditions led to innovations in legal procedure and jurisprudence that anticipated many later developments in comparative law. Elamite legal codes during this period recognized multiple sources of legal authority and provided procedures for resolving conflicts between different legal systems, innovations that reflected the practical experience of governing a truly multicultural empire. The diplomatic achievements of the Sukkalmah period established Elam as one of the major powers in international politics throughout the ancient Near East. Elamite diplomatic correspondence from this period shows the kingdom maintaining relationships with powers as distant as Mari in Syria and engaging in complex negotiations over trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and military alliances. The consultative nature of the Sukkalmah system proved particularly effective in diplomatic contexts, as foreign powers found Elamite negotiators more flexible and reliable than the representatives of more autocratic regimes. By 1500 BCE, the Sukkalmah system had proven its effectiveness through 4 centuries of successful governance that had made Elam one of the most stable and prosperous powers in the ancient world. The governmental innovations developed during this period had created a political culture that emphasized consultation, adaptation, and respect for diversity, values that would continue to influence Elamite civilization long after the Sukkalmah system itself had evolved into new forms of organization. But the very success of the Sukkalmah system had also created new challenges and opportunities that would test its adaptability in the changing political environment of the late 2nd millennium BCE. As new powers emerged in Mesopotamia, and the balance of regional politics began to shift once again. Around 1792 BCE, the delicate balance of power that had allowed the Sukkalmah system to flourish faced its most serious challenge since the fall of Ur-III. In the Mesopotamian city of Babylon, an Amorite king named Hammurabi was beginning a series of conquests that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Unlike the fragmented city-states and tribal confederations that had characterized Mesopotamian politics since the collapse of Ur-III, Hammurabi was creating a centralized kingdom that combined the administrative sophistication of earlier Mesopotamian empires with the military innovations and political flexibility that the Amorite dynasties had introduced to the region. The challenge that Hammurabi's expansion posed to Elamite interests was qualitatively different from any threat the Sukkalmahs had previously faced. Where earlier, Mesopotamian powers had typically focused their expansion efforts on controlling specific trade routes or tributary relationships, Hammurabi was systematically conquering and integrating entire regions into a unified Babylonian state. His ultimate goal was nothing less than the recreation of Mesopotamian unity under Babylonian leadership, an ambition that directly threatened the careful balance of divided Mesopotamian authority that had allowed Elam to project influence far beyond its actual territorial boundaries. Hammurabi's early campaigns revealed the effectiveness of the new Babylonian military and administrative system. Rather than simply raiding neighboring territories for tribute and prestige, as traditional Mesopotamian warfare had typically involved, Hammurabi's armies conquered cities and regions with the intention of permanent incorporation into the Babylonian kingdom. His administrative reforms created standardized legal codes, uniform taxation systems, and centralized bureaucratic controls that allowed him to extract maximum resources from conquered territories while minimizing the costs of occupation and governance. The Elamite response to Hammurabi's expansion was coordinated primarily by Siwe-Palar-Hupak, who served as Sukkalmah during the crucial decades when Babylonian power was reaching its peak. Siwe-Palar-Hupak understood that traditional Elamite military strategies, which had worked effectively against fragmented Mesopotamian city-states, would be inadequate against the unified Babylonian kingdom that Hammurabi was creating. Instead of attempting direct military confrontation with Babylonian forces, he developed a sophisticated diplomatic strategy designed to limit Babylonian expansion while preserving Elamite influence through indirect means. The centerpiece of Siwe-Palar-Hupak's anti-Babylonian strategy was his systematic effort to build coalitions among the remaining independent Mesopotamian city-states that were threatened by Hammurabi's expansion. Cities like Mari, Eshnunna, and Larsa had maintained their independence through the period of political fragmentation that followed the fall of Ur III, but each was too weak individually to resist Babylonian conquest. By coordinating their defensive efforts and providing them with military and financial support, Siwe-Palar-Hupak hoped to create a buffer zone of allied states that would limit Babylonian expansion eastward toward Elamite territories. This coalition-building strategy required unprecedented levels of diplomatic sophistication and represented a significant evolution in Elamite foreign policy. Previous Elamite rulers had typically dealt with Mesopotamian powers through bilateral relationships, either as enemies to be fought or as allies to be supported. Siwe-Palar-Hupak's approach, by contrast, required managing complex multilateral relationships involving multiple independent actors with varying interests and capabilities. The success of this strategy depended on Elamite diplomats' ability to balance competing demands and conflicting priorities while maintaining overall coherence in anti-Babylonian efforts. The diplomatic correspondence from this period, preserved in archives at Mari and other sites, reveals the sophistication of Elamite diplomatic practices under the Sukkalmah system. Elamite negotiators demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adapting their proposals to the specific needs and concerns of different potential allies. They offered military support to cities threatened by immediate Babylonian attack, commercial privileges to trading centers concerned about economic disruption, and political recognition to local rulers worried about maintaining their autonomy under changing regional conditions. However, the effectiveness of Elamite coalition building was ultimately limited by the same factors that made Hammurabi's expansion so successful. The Babylonian kingdom offered potential subjects significant advantages that Elamite-led coalitions could not match. Hammurabi's legal codes provided predictable and equitable procedures for resolving commercial disputes. His administrative systems offered efficient governance that reduced local conflicts and improved economic productivity. And his military forces provided security against raiders and external threats that individual city-states could not achieve independently. As Hammurabi's conquests continued, city after city chose accommodation with Babylon over resistance supported by Elam. The fall of Mari around 1761 BCE was particularly devastating to Elamite strategic interests, as it eliminated one of the most important centers of anti-Babylonian coalition activity and gave Hammurabi control over crucial trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Syria and Anatolia. The conquest of Eshnunna a few years later extended Babylonian control eastward to the very borders of Elamite territory and eliminated the last significant Mesopotamian ally upon whom Elamite strategy had depended. The failure of coalition-building strategies forced Sukkalmah to reconsider fundamental assumptions about Elamite foreign policy. For over 2 centuries, since the fall of Ur III, Elamite strategy had been based on the principle that Mesopotamian political fragmentation was essential to Elamite security and prosperity. The emergence of a unified Babylonian kingdom under effective leadership threatened to recreate the conditions that had made Akkadian and Ur-III expansion so dangerous to Elamite independence. The Elamite adaptation to Babylonian unification involved a strategic retreat from direct involvement in Mesopotamian politics, combined with intensified efforts to strengthen Elamite control over their own traditional territories. Rather than continuing to compete directly with Babylon for influence over disputed border regions, Sukkalmah focused on consolidating Elamite authority in the highland regions of Fars and the southeastern territories that connected Elam with the Persian Gulf and the trade routes leading toward the Indus Valley. This strategic reorientation required significant adjustments to the political and economic foundations of the Sukkalmah system. The wealth that had supported Elamite expansion during the previous 2 centuries had come primarily from tribute and commercial privileges extracted from Mesopotamian cities under Elamite influence. With these sources of revenue eliminated by Babylonian expansion, the Sukkalmahs needed to develop alternative economic foundations for their kingdom. The solution involved intensifying the development of Elamite internal resources, particularly the metallurgical industries and craft production that took advantage of the kingdom's mineral wealth and skilled artisan populations. Archaeological evidence from this period shows significant expansion of bronze working facilities, precious metal processing, and luxury craft production throughout Elamite territory. The government also invested heavily in improving transportation infrastructure to facilitate trade with regions beyond Babylonian control, particularly the emerging commercial networks that connected the Persian Gulf with India and Central Asia. Religious and cultural developments during the Hammurabi period reflected the broader strategic challenges facing Elamite civilization. The loss of influence in Mesopotamian religious centers forced Elamite religious authorities to place greater emphasis on distinctively Elamite spiritual traditions and sacred sites within their own territories. This religious reorientation helped strengthen Elamite cultural identity during a period when external political pressures might otherwise have encouraged assimilation to Babylonian cultural models. The legal innovations of Hammurabi's famous law code also influenced Elamite legal development, though in characteristically selective ways. Elamite legal scholars studied Babylonian legal procedures and incorporated useful innovations while maintaining the consultative and multicultural approaches that distinguished Elamite jurisprudence from Mesopotamian legal traditions. The result was a synthesis that improved the efficiency of Elamite legal procedures while preserving the flexibility that made the Sukkalmah system effective for governing diverse populations. By 1750 BCE, when Hammurabi's active reign was ending, the Elamite response to Babylonian expansion had achieved a qualified success. While Elam had lost much of its traditional influence over Mesopotamian affairs, the kingdom had successfully adapted to changed circumstances without sacrificing its independence or fundamental political institutions. The Sukkalmah system had proven flexible enough to accommodate strategic retreat and internal reorganization while maintaining the essential characteristics that distinguished Elamite civilization from its neighbors. The confrontation with Hammurabi's Babylon had also taught important lessons about the changing nature of international politics in the ancient Near East. The age of small city-states and tribal confederations was giving way to an era of larger, more centralized kingdoms with greater resources and more sophisticated administrative capabilities. For Elam to maintain its independence and prosperity in this new environment, it would need to continue adapting its traditional institutions while developing new sources of strength that could compete with the advantages that large-scale political unification provided to its rivals. Around 1500 BCE, the political landscape of Mesopotamia underwent another dramatic transformation that would create unprecedented opportunities for Elamite diplomacy and expansion. The Babylonian kingdom that Hammurabi had built through decades of careful conquest and administrative innovation collapsed under the pressure of external invasions and internal instability, leaving a power vacuum that would be filled by one of the most unusual dynasties in ancient Near Eastern history. The Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains whose origins and early culture remain largely mysterious to modern scholars. The Kassite conquest of Babylon represented more than simply another change of dynasty in Mesopotamian politics. Unlike the Amorite rulers who had preceded them, the Kassites brought fundamentally different approaches to governance, military organization, and international relations that would reshape the entire regional balance of power. For the Elamites, the emergence of Kassite Babylon created both opportunities and challenges that would test the adaptability of the Sukkalmah system in ways that even Hammurabi's expansion had not required. The collapse of Hammurabi's dynasty had been a gradual process rather than a sudden catastrophe. The administrative burdens of governing a unified Mesopotamian kingdom proved increasingly difficult to sustain as climate change reduced agricultural productivity and external pressures mounted from peoples migrating from the north and east. The final blow came from a devastating raid by the Hittite king Mursili I around 1595 BCE, which captured Babylon itself and effectively ended the Old Babylonian period. Though Hittite forces withdrew almost immediately rather than attempting to hold territory so far from their Anatolian homeland. Into this political vacuum stepped the Kassites, whose origins in the mountains of western Iran made them natural neighbors and potential rivals of the Elamites. But unlike the Mesopotamian powers that had traditionally competed with Elam for territorial control and commercial advantage, the Kassites brought a fundamentally different set of priorities and capabilities to regional politics. They were primarily interested in establishing stable control over the agricultural wealth of the Mesopotamian river valleys, rather than pursuing the expansionist ambitions that had characterized earlier Babylonian and Assyrian policies. This difference in strategic priorities created opportunities for Elamite-Kassite cooperation that would have been impossible under previous Mesopotamian dynasties. The Kassites needed allies who could help them secure their eastern borders against potential threats from the Iranian plateau, while the Elamites saw advantages in working with a Mesopotamian power that was not actively competing for control over the highland trade routes and mountain resources that formed the foundation of Elamite prosperity. The first formal treaty between Elam and Kassite Babylon was negotiated during the reign of the Kassite king Kashtiliash III around 1450 BCE, working with the contemporary Elamite Sukkalmah, whose name, unfortunately, has not survived in complete form in the fragmentary records available to modern historians. This treaty established principles of mutual recognition and non-aggression that would govern Elamite-Kassite relations for over a century, and created precedents for international law that influenced diplomatic practices throughout the ancient Near East. The terms of the Elamite-Kassite Treaty revealed the sophisticated understanding of international relations that both powers had developed during their respective experiences with Mesopotamian politics. Rather than simply establishing temporary military alliances based on immediate shared interests, the treaty created permanent diplomatic institutions designed to manage ongoing relationships between the two kingdoms. These included regular exchanges of ambassadors, standardized procedures for resolving commercial disputes, and formal mechanisms for coordinating military activities against common enemies. Perhaps most importantly, the treaty recognized the principle of spheres of influence that allowed each power to maintain primary authority within its traditional territories while cooperating in contested border regions. The Kassites acknowledged Elamite supremacy over the trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Iranian plateau, while the Elamites recognized Kassite authority over the river valleys and accepted limitations on their traditional rights to intervene in Mesopotamian city-state politics. The military cooperation that developed under this treaty framework proved particularly effective in dealing with the various nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who threatened settled civilization throughout the region during this period. The 15th century BCE was characterized by significant population movements as climate change and political instability forced many groups to migrate in search of new territories and resources. Both Elam and Kassite Babylon faced periodic raids and invasion attempts from these displaced populations, and their coordinated military responses proved far more effective than either power could have achieved independently. The most significant test of Elamite-Kassite military cooperation came during the campaigns against the Sutian tribes around 1400 BCE. These nomadic peoples had established themselves in the Middle Euphrates region and were launching increasingly serious raids against both Kassite and Elamite territories. The joint military expedition that finally defeated the Sutians demonstrated the effectiveness of combining Elamite mobility and highland warfare expertise with Kassite organizational capabilities and siege warfare techniques. Economic cooperation between Elam and Kassite Babylon during this period created unprecedented prosperity for both kingdoms. The Kassites had inherited control over the most productive agricultural regions in Mesopotamia, while the Elamites controlled the trade routes that connected these agricultural areas with markets throughout the Iranian plateau and beyond. By coordinating their economic policies and eliminating the commercial warfare that had characterized earlier periods, both powers were able to maximize the benefits of regional trade while minimizing the costs of military competition. The diplomatic correspondence between Elamite and Kassite courts during this period, preserved in archives at Babylon and other sites, reveals the sophisticated administrative apparatus that both powers developed to manage their complex relationship. Regular diplomatic exchanges included not only formal negotiations between rulers, but also technical consultations between specialists in areas ranging from irrigation engineering to military technology. These professional exchanges facilitated the transfer of knowledge and expertise that benefited both civilizations while strengthening the personal relationships that made continued cooperation possible. Cultural exchanges during the Elamite-Kassite alliance period created some of the most distinctive artistic and architectural achievements in both civilizations. Kassite royal patronage supported Elamite craftsmen working in Babylonian cities, while Elamite courts welcomed Kassite artists and scholars whose work contributed to the cosmopolitan culture that characterized the Sukkalmah period. The result was a cultural synthesis that incorporated elements from both traditions while creating new forms of artistic expression that influenced developments throughout the ancient Near East. Religious cooperation between the two powers was particularly significant for the long-term development of both Elamite and Mesopotamian spiritual traditions. The Kassites had brought their own mountain deities with them when they conquered Babylon, creating opportunities for religious synthesis with Elamite spiritual traditions that shared similar highland origins. At the same time, Kassite adoption of traditional Babylonian religious practices created new opportunities for Elamite participation in Mesopotamian religious festivals and ceremonies that had previously been closed to foreign powers. The legal innovations that emerged from Elamite-Kassite cooperation anticipated many later developments in international law and commercial regulation. The need to coordinate legal procedures between two different judicial systems led to innovations in conflict resolution, commercial arbitration, and diplomatic immunity that provided models for later international agreements throughout the ancient world. These legal developments were particularly important for facilitating the commercial exchanges that formed the economic foundation of the alliance. However, the very success of Elamite-Kassite cooperation also created new tensions and challenges that would ultimately threaten the stability of their alliance. As both powers grew stronger and more prosperous through their cooperative relationship, their strategic interests began to diverge in ways that made continued cooperation increasingly difficult. The Kassites' growing confidence in their ability to control Mesopotamian affairs led to renewed interest in expanding their influence eastward, while Elamite success in developing alternative trade routes reduced their dependence on Kassite cooperation for economic prosperity. By 1400 BCE, the golden age of Elamite-Kassite cooperation was beginning to show signs of strain as new generations of leaders in both kingdoms questioned whether continued alliance served their respective national interests. The diplomatic institutions that had managed the relationship so successfully for over a century were finding it increasingly difficult to reconcile the competing ambitions that prosperity and success had generated in both courts. Around 1340 BCE, the Elamite kingdom entered what would prove to be the most spectacular period of cultural achievement and territorial expansion in its entire history. Under the leadership of King Dur-Untash, whose reign from approximately 1340 to 1300 BCE marked the transition from the Sukkalmah period to what historians call the Middle Elamite Empire, the diverse territories and peoples that had been united under earlier dynasties were transformed into a powerful imperial state that rivaled any contemporary civilization in military might, architectural grandeur, and cultural sophistication. Dur-Untash came to power during a period when the traditional Sukkalmah system of shared leadership was evolving toward more centralized royal authority. The success of earlier cooperative arrangements with Kassite Babylon had demonstrated the advantages of unified leadership in international affairs, while the growing complexity of governing an increasingly prosperous and diverse kingdom required more efficient decision-making processes than the consultative procedures of the classical Sukkalmah period could provide. Dur-Untash political innovations represented a synthesis of traditional Elamite governmental flexibility with the administrative efficiency that contemporary imperial powers had developed to manage large-scale territorial states. The most visible and enduring achievement of Dur-Untash reign was his creation of an entirely new royal city at Dur-Untash, modern Chogha-Zanbil, located in the Khuzestan plain approximately 30 miles southeast of Susa. This massive construction project, which occupied much of his 40-year reign, represented far more than simple royal aggrandizement. It was a carefully planned demonstration of Elamite power and cultural distinctiveness that established new standards for monumental architecture throughout the ancient Near East, while serving practical functions as a religious center, administrative capital, and symbol of imperial unity. The centerpiece of Dur-Untash was a magnificent ziggurat dedicated to the Elamite god Inshushinak, whose cult had been elevated by Dur-Untash to serve as the primary religious focus for his expanded kingdom. Unlike the ziggurats built by Mesopotamian rulers, which typically formed part of larger urban complexes, the Chogha-Zanbil ziggurat was designed as a self-contained religious and administrative center surrounded by carefully planned residential quarters, workshops, and storage facilities that could function independently of existing cities. The architectural innovations displayed at Chogha-Zanbil reflected the cosmopolitan character of Dur-Untash kingdom and the sophisticated engineering capabilities that Elamite civilization had developed by the 14th century BCE. The ziggurat itself rose to a height of over 150 feet in 5 distinct levels, each constructed using different building techniques and decorative schemes that demonstrated mastery of various architectural traditions. The lowest level used massive mud brick construction similar to Mesopotamian building techniques, while higher levels incorporated distinctively Elamite innovations including glazed brick facades, intricate relief carvings, and bronze decorative elements that reflected the kingdom's metallurgical expertise. The construction of Dur-Untash required unprecedented coordination of human and material resources that demonstrated the administrative capabilities of Dur-Untash government. Archaeological evidence suggests that the project employed thousands of workers over several decades, including skilled craftsmen from throughout the kingdom and beyond. The logistics of quarrying and transporting building materials, coordinating the work of different craft specialists, and maintaining supply lines for such a massive undertaking required administrative innovations that influenced government organization throughout the Middle Elamite period. Perhaps most significantly, the decoration and furnishing of Dur-Untash showcased artistic achievements that established new standards for royal patronage throughout the ancient Near East. The glazed brick reliefs that adorned the ziggurat's upper levels depicted complex mythological scenes that combined traditional Elamite religious imagery with influences from Mesopotamian, Anatolian, and even Egyptian artistic traditions. These artistic syntheses reflected the international scope of Dur-Untash-Napirisha's diplomatic relationships and the cultural sophistication of his court. The military campaigns that supported and were supported by these architectural achievements transformed Elam from a regional power into a true imperial state. Dur-Untash-Napirisha's armies extended Elamite control deep into the Zagros Mountains to the north and east, bringing highland peoples under direct royal authority for the first time in Elamite history. These mountain campaigns served multiple purposes. They secured control over mineral resources that funded the king's building projects. They eliminated potential threats from unconquered tribal groups, and they demonstrated Elamite military capabilities to potential enemies in Mesopotamia and elsewhere. The Highland campaigns revealed significant innovations in Elamite military organization and tactics. Dur-Untash-Napirisha's armies combined traditional Elamite strengths in mobility and irregular warfare with new capabilities in siege warfare and large-scale battlefield operations that reflected careful study of contemporary military developments throughout the ancient Near East. The king's generals developed new techniques for coordinating infantry, archers, and early cavalry units in complex operations that could adapt to the varied terrain found throughout the expanded kingdom. Archaeological evidence from sites conquered during Dur-Untash-Napirisha's reign shows the systematic approach his forces took to integrating conquered territories into the imperial administration. Rather than simply extracting tribute and withdrawing, Elamite forces established permanent administrative centers, constructed road networks to facilitate communication and transportation, and created local governmental structures that balanced imperial control with respect for traditional local authorities. This approach to imperial governance would influence Elamite administrative practices for centuries to come. The economic foundations of Dur-Untash-Napirisha's achievements rested on innovations in resource extraction and trade organization that maximized the wealth-generating potential of the kingdom's diverse territories. Royal workshops established at Dur-Untash and other centers specialized in producing luxury goods that combined the finest materials available throughout the empire with the most sophisticated craft techniques that Elamite artisans had developed. These workshops produced not only goods for royal use, but also trade items that generated the commercial revenues necessary to fund continued expansion and construction. The agricultural innovations sponsored by Dur-Untash-Napirisha's government were equally significant for the long-term prosperity of the kingdom. Royal engineers developed new irrigation techniques that increased agricultural productivity in both highland and lowland regions, while government policies encouraged the cultivation of new crops that could take advantage of the diverse microclimates found throughout Elamite territory. These agricultural improvements supported the growing population that the king's military and construction projects required while generating surplus wealth that could be invested in further expansion. Religious developments during Dur-Untash-Napirisha's reign established new syntheses between traditional Elamite spiritual practices and the diverse religious traditions found throughout the expanded kingdom. The elevation of Inshushinak as the primary royal deity reflected careful political calculation as well as genuine religious conviction. Inshushinak was traditionally associated with Susa and the lowland regions where Elamite power had originated, but the god's cult could be adapted to incorporate highland spiritual traditions and foreign religious influences without losing its distinctively Elamite character. The religious festivals and ceremonies established at Dur-Untash served important political functions in addition to their spiritual significance. These events brought together representatives from throughout the kingdom for celebrations that reinforced imperial unity while demonstrating royal wealth and power to both subjects and foreign visitors. The elaborate rituals performed at the Great Ziggurat combined traditional Elamite religious practices with innovations that reflected the international character of Dur-Untash empire. Cultural exchanges facilitated by Dur-Untash diplomatic relationships brought new ideas and techniques to Elamite civilization while spreading Elamite influences throughout the ancient Near East. The king's court attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from distant lands who contributed their expertise to royal projects while learning Elamite techniques that they carried back to their homelands. These cultural exchanges enriched Elamite civilization while establishing its reputation for sophistication and learning throughout the known world. By 1300 BCE, when Dur-Untash long reign was ending, he had transformed Elam into one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in the ancient world. The kingdom he left to his successors controlled territory from the Persian Gulf to the central Zagros Mountains, commanded military forces that rivaled those of any contemporary power, and possessed architectural and artistic achievements that demonstrated cultural sophistication equal to anything found in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The precedents established during Dur-Untash reign, the combination of military expansion with cultural achievement, the synthesis of traditional Elamite values with international influences, and the creation of imperial institutions capable of governing diverse populations across vast territories would define Elamite imperial aspirations for the next 2 centuries and create the foundation for even more spectacular achievements under his successors. In 1158 BCE, the ancient world witnessed one of the most audacious military campaigns in its history. Shutruk-Nahhunte I, king of Anshan and Susa, launched a massive invasion of Babylonia that would culminate in the capture of Babylon itself and the systematic looting of treasures that had accumulated in Mesopotamian temples and palaces for over a millennium. This extraordinary expedition, which modern historians often call the Great Raid, represented the absolute peak of Elamite military power and marked the moment when Elam transformed from a regional kingdom into the dominant imperial force in the ancient Near East. The campaign that would make Shutruk-Nahhunte famous throughout the ancient world emerged from a carefully calculated assessment of regional political conditions. The Kassite dynasty that had ruled Babylon for over 3 centuries was showing clear signs of weakness and internal division. Climate change had reduced agricultural productivity throughout Mesopotamia, creating economic pressures that strained the administrative systems upon which Kassite authority depended. More importantly, the rise of Assyrian power in the north was creating new military pressures that forced the Kassites to divide their attention and resources between multiple threats. Shutruk-Nahhunte recognized that these conditions created a unique opportunity for Elamite expansion. Unlike previous Elamite rulers who had typically pursued limited objectives in their conflicts with Mesopotamian powers, he envisioned a campaign that would establish Elamite hegemony over the entire region while demonstrating Elam's cultural and military superiority to the world. The preparations for this unprecedented undertaking occupied several years and required innovations in military organization, logistics, and strategic planning that pushed Elamite capabilities to their absolute limits. The army that Shutruk-Nahhunte assembled for his Babylonian campaign was the largest and most sophisticated military force that Elam had ever fielded. Archaeological evidence suggests that his forces numbered in the tens of thousands, making them comparable in size to the armies of the greatest contemporary powers. More importantly, this was a truly professional military force organized around standardized equipment, coordinated tactical procedures, and specialized units trained for specific functions including siege warfare, cavalry operations, and the engineering tasks necessary for large-scale construction and destruction projects. The military innovations that made Shutruk-Nahhunte's campaign possible reflected the technological and organizational advances that Elamite civilization had achieved during the Middle Elamite period. Elamite metallurgy had reached new levels of sophistication, producing weapons and armor that were superior to anything available to most contemporary armies. Elamite engineers had developed siege techniques that could overcome the massive fortifications that protected major Mesopotamian cities. Perhaps most importantly, Elamite commanders had learned to coordinate complex military operations across vast distances using communication and supply systems that allowed sustained campaigns far from their home territories. The invasion began with a series of coordinated attacks on Kassite strongholds in the eastern regions of Babylonia. Rather than advancing directly toward Babylon, Shutruk-Nahhunte's forces systematically conquered the outlying cities and fortresses that formed the defensive perimeter of the Kassite kingdom. This methodical approach served multiple purposes. It eliminated potential bases for Kassite counterattacks. It provided opportunities for Elamite forces to capture supplies and equipment necessary for the siege of Babylon, and it demonstrated Elamite military capabilities to potential allies and enemies throughout the region. The psychological impact of these preliminary victories was as important as their military significance. Cities throughout Mesopotamia had grown accustomed to viewing Elam as a highland kingdom capable of raids and limited campaigns, but not of sustained conquest and occupation. The systematic efficiency with which Shutruk-Nahhunte's forces captured well-fortified positions challenged fundamental assumptions about Elamite capabilities and forced Mesopotamian rulers to reconsider their assessment of the regional balance of power. The siege of Babylon itself revealed the full extent of Elamite military evolution. The techniques that Shutruk-Nahhunte's engineers employed combined traditional Elamite expertise in mountain warfare with innovations borrowed from the military traditions of every major power in the ancient Near East. Elamite siege engines used principles derived from Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Hittite engineering, while Elamite tactical procedures incorporated lessons learned from careful observation of contemporary military developments throughout the known world. Perhaps more importantly, the siege demonstrated unprecedented logistical capabilities that allowed Elamite forces to maintain their effectiveness during extended operations, far from their supply bases. The administrative systems that Dur-Untash had developed for his construction projects proved equally effective for coordinating the complex requirements of large-scale military campaigns. Elamite quartermasters established supply networks that could transport food, equipment, and reinforcements across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory while maintaining the security and morale necessary for continued military effectiveness. The fall of Babylon, after several months of siege, marked a turning point not just in Elamite history, but in the broader development of ancient Near Eastern civilization. For the first time since the collapse of Ur-III over 8 centuries earlier, a non-Mesopotamian power had achieved complete military control over the political and cultural center of Mesopotamian civilization. The symbolic significance of this achievement extended far beyond its immediate military implications to challenge fundamental assumptions about cultural superiority and political legitimacy that had dominated ancient Near Eastern thinking for over a millennium. The systematic looting that followed Babylon's capture revealed the true scope of Shutruk-Nahhunte's ambitions. This was not simply a military raid designed to capture portable wealth and withdraw quickly. Instead, it was a carefully planned cultural appropriation intended to transfer the symbols and sources of Mesopotamian prestige to Elamite control. The treasures that Elamite forces removed from Babylonian temples and palaces included some of the most important artifacts in Mesopotamian history, objects whose possession had traditionally been understood to legitimize political authority throughout the region. The most famous of these captured treasures was the black stone stele containing Hammurabi's law code, which had stood in Babylon for over 500 years as a symbol of Mesopotamian legal and cultural achievement. The removal of this monument to Susa represented more than simple looting. It was a deliberate statement that Elamite civilization had surpassed Mesopotamian achievements and had the right to claim the cultural heritage that Mesopotamian powers had previously monopolized. Along with Hammurabi's stele, Shutruk-Nahhunte's forces captured thousands of other objects that represented the accumulated cultural wealth of Mesopotamian civilization. These included royal statues, religious artifacts, ceremonial weapons, precious metals, jewels, and artistic works that had been created over centuries by the finest craftsmen in the ancient world. The transfer of these treasures to Elamite territory represented one of the largest movements of cultural wealth in ancient history and established Susa as a major center of artistic and intellectual achievement. The administrative procedures that Shutruk-Nahhunte established for governing conquered Babylonian territories demonstrated the sophisticated imperial vision that motivated his campaigns. Rather than simply extracting tribute and withdrawing, as earlier conquerors had typically done, Shutruk-Nahhunte established permanent Elamite governmental structures designed to integrate Babylonian resources and populations into an expanded Elamite Empire. These administrative innovations required unprecedented coordination between Elamite and Mesopotamian governmental traditions and created new models for imperial administration that influenced political development throughout the ancient Near East. The cultural impact of Shutruk-Nahhunte's conquests extended far beyond the immediate transfer of artistic treasures. The presence of Mesopotamian craftsmen, scholars, and religious specialists in Elamite territory created opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched both civilizations while establishing new synthetic traditions that combined the best elements of each cultural heritage. The royal workshops that Shutruk-Nahhunte established to maintain and enhance his captured treasures became centers of artistic innovation that produced works rivaling anything created in the ancient world. The success of Shutruk-Nahhunte's Babylonian campaign established Elam as the dominant power in the ancient Near East and created precedents for imperial expansion that would influence Elamite policy for the next century. The military, administrative, and cultural capabilities that his reign had demonstrated proved that Elamite civilization possessed all the attributes necessary for great power status and could compete successfully with any contemporary empire. The treasures captured during the Great Raid would remain in Susa for centuries, serving as constant reminders of Elamite military achievement and cultural sophistication. But they would also become targets for future conquerors who sought to reverse Shutruk-Nahhunte's achievements and restore Mesopotamian prestige through the recovery of their stolen heritage, setting the stage for conflicts that would ultimately determine the fate of Elamite imperial ambitions. The glory of Shutruk-Nahhunte's conquests proved to be shorter-lived than anyone could have anticipated. Within little more than a generation, the Elamite Empire that had seemed invincible during the Great Raid found itself facing a Babylonian resurgence that would not only reverse all of Shutruk-Nahhunte's achievements, but would devastate Elamite power so thoroughly that the kingdom would never again achieve the same level of regional dominance. The architect of this dramatic reversal was Nebuchadnezzar I, a Babylonian king whose systematic campaigns against Elam between 1125 and 1100 BCE would earn him lasting fame as the ruler who restored Mesopotamian prestige and ended the Middle Elamite period forever. The Babylonian recovery that made Nebuchadnezzar's revenge possible began during the later years of Shutruk-Nahhunte's successors, when the administrative burdens of governing an expanded empire began to strain the governmental systems that had made Elamite expansion possible. The very success of Elamite conquests had created new challenges that proved increasingly difficult to manage. The integration of Babylonian territories into the Elamite administrative system required resources and expertise that stretched Elamite capabilities beyond their limits, while the need to garrison conquered territories reduced the military forces available for defending the Elamite heartland. More fundamentally, the cultural appropriation that had been such a visible symbol of Elamite triumph created powerful motivations for Babylonian resistance that went far beyond normal political or territorial disputes. The removal of Hammurabi's stelae and other sacred objects from their traditional locations had violated religious and cultural sensibilities in ways that made compromise or accommodation nearly impossible. For Babylonians, the recovery of their stolen heritage became a sacred duty that justified any sacrifice necessary to achieve success. Nebuchadnezzar I came to power around 1126 BCE as the fourth ruler of what historians call the Second Dynasty of Awan, a line of Babylonian kings who had maintained nominal independence in central Mesopotamia during the period of Elamite expansion. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on defensive strategies designed to preserve Babylonian autonomy within the Elamite sphere of influence, Nebuchadnezzar possessed both the vision and the capabilities necessary to mount a systematic campaign for the complete expulsion of Elamite power from Mesopotamian territory. The military innovations that made Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns possible reflected careful study of Elamite methods combined with traditional Mesopotamian strengths in organization and logistics. Babylonian armies under Nebuchadnezzar's command were smaller than the massive forces that Shutruk-Nahhunte had assembled, but they were more efficient and better adapted to the specific challenges of campaigning in Elamite territory. Babylonian military engineers developed new techniques for operating in the mountainous terrain where many Elamite strongholds were located, while Babylonian intelligence services created networks of local allies who could provide information about Elamite movements and weaknesses. Perhaps most importantly, Nebuchadnezzar understood that military success against Elam required more than simply winning battles. The recovery of Babylonian independence necessitated the systematic destruction of the administrative and economic infrastructure that supported Elamite control over Mesopotamian territory. This meant not only capturing Elamite garrisons and administrative centers, but also eliminating the commercial networks, transportation systems, and local power structures that made Elamite governance effective. The first phase of Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns focused on isolating Elamite forces in Mesopotamia from their supply bases and reinforcements in the Iranian highlands. Rather than attempting direct assaults on strongly fortified positions, Babylonian forces systematically captured the smaller towns and strategic points that controlled communication routes between Elam proper and its Mesopotamian territories. This methodical approach gradually reduced Elamite territorial control while avoiding the massive casualties that frontal attacks on major fortifications would have required. The psychological impact of these early Babylonian successes proved as damaging to Elamite power as their immediate military consequences. The systematic efficiency with which Nebuchadnezzar's forces reversed decades of Elamite expansion challenged the prestige and legitimacy that had been crucial elements of Elamite imperial control. Local populations throughout Mesopotamia began to question whether continued cooperation with Elamite authorities served their interests, while potential allies in other regions reconsidered their assessment of Elamite military capabilities. As Babylonian forces pushed eastward toward the Iranian border, they encountered increasingly desperate Elamite resistance that revealed both the strengths and limitations of the imperial system that Shutruk-Nahhunte had created. Elamite commanders demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility and fought with the skill and determination that had made their earlier conquests possible. However, the political and logistical foundations that had supported earlier Elamite successes were crumbling under the pressure of sustained Babylonian assault. The crucial turning point in Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns came with his successful siege of Dur, a fortified city on the Mesopotamian Elamite border that served as the primary administrative center for Elamite control over their western territories. The fall of Dur, after months of determined resistance, eliminated the last major Elamite stronghold in Mesopotamia and opened the route for Babylonian invasion of Elamite territory proper. The invasion of Elam itself represented an unprecedented achievement in Mesopotamian military history. No Babylonian army had successfully penetrated deep into Elamite territory since the campaigns of Hammurabi over 6 centuries earlier. And even those earlier expeditions had been limited raids rather than systematic conquest campaigns. Nebuchadnezzar's forces, by contrast, advanced steadily through the Elamite heartland, capturing cities and devastating the infrastructure that had supported Middle Elamite prosperity. The climax of Nebuchadnezzar's revenge came with his capture of Susa, the ancient capital that had served as the center of Elamite power for over a millennium. The siege of Susa was particularly symbolic because it represented the reversal of Shutruk-Nahhunte's earlier triumph at Babylon. Just as Elamite forces had systematically looted Babylonian temples and palaces, Babylonian armies now stripped Susa of the treasures that had made it one of the richest cities in the ancient world. The recovery of Hammurabi's stele and other sacred objects that Shutruk-Nahhunte had removed from Babylon became the centerpiece of Nebuchadnezzar's propaganda campaign. But the Babylonian king went beyond simple recovery to engage in his own program of cultural appropriation that paralleled Elamite methods. Babylonian forces captured Elamite religious statues, royal regalia, and ceremonial objects that had served as symbols of Elamite divine favor and political legitimacy. The removal of these sacred objects to Babylon represented more than military victory. It was a deliberate attempt to transfer divine approval from Elamite to Babylonian rule. The devastation that Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns inflicted on Elamite territory extended far beyond the immediate destruction of military and governmental facilities. Systematic Babylonian attacks on irrigation systems, urban centers, and transportation infrastructure created economic damage that would take generations to repair. The deportation of skilled craftsmen, administrators, and religious specialists to Babylon deprived Elamite society of much of the human expertise necessary for effective governance and cultural development. Perhaps most damaging to long-term Elamite recovery was the destruction of the governmental institutions and administrative systems that had made Middle Elamite expansion possible. The complex bureaucratic procedures, legal traditions, and diplomatic relationships that had enabled Elamite rulers to govern diverse populations across vast territories were disrupted beyond repair. Future Elamite rulers would need to rebuild these institutional foundations from scratch while dealing with the immediate challenges of physical reconstruction and external threats. The international consequences of Nebuchadnezzar's victories extended throughout the ancient Near East as other powers adjusted their policies to reflect the new balance of regional strength. Kings and city-states that had acknowledged Elamite supremacy during the Middle Elamite period now transferred their allegiance to Babylon, while enemies who had been deterred by Elamite power began to consider opportunities for expansion at Elamite expense. The religious and cultural impact of Babylon's triumph created lasting changes in how ancient Near Eastern peoples understood the relationship between political power and divine favor. The systematic reversal of Elamite conquests seemed to demonstrate that the gods had withdrawn their support from Elamite civilization and transferred their approval to Babylonian leadership. This theological interpretation of political events influenced religious thinking throughout the region and contributed to the legitimacy that Nebuchadnezzar's dynasty enjoyed in the aftermath of its military successes. By 1100 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar's active campaigns were ending, the transformation of regional politics was complete. The Elamite Empire that had dominated the ancient Near East for over a century had been reduced to a collection of mountain strongholds struggling to maintain basic governmental functions. The cultural treasures that had symbolized Elamite achievement were once again housed in Babylonian temples, while the administrative and military capabilities that had made Elamite expansion possible lay in ruins. The end of the Middle Elamite period marked more than simply another change in the regional balance of power. It represented the conclusion of the most successful phase in Elamite imperial history and forced a fundamental reconsideration of the strategies and institutions that had made Elamite civilization distinctive. The survivors of Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns would need to develop entirely new approaches to governance, diplomacy, and cultural development if Elamite civilization was to survive in the changed world that Babylonian victory had created. The decades following Nebuchadnezzar's devastating campaigns marked the beginning of what historians call the most obscure period in Elamite history. From approximately 1100 to 750 BCE, the once mighty empire that had dominated the ancient Near East fragmented into a collection of highland kingdoms and tribal confederations, whose activities left so few written records that scholars struggle to reconstruct even the basic outline of political developments. This period of historical silence reflects not just the destruction of Elamite governmental institutions, but a fundamental transformation in how Elamite society organized itself for survival in a world where the imperial ambitions of earlier centuries had become impossible to sustain. The immediate aftermath of Babylonian conquest created challenges that went far beyond the obvious problems of physical reconstruction and political reorganization. The systematic destruction of administrative centers, irrigation systems, and urban infrastructure had disrupted the economic foundations that had supported Elamite civilization for over a millennium. More critically, the deportation of skilled administrators, craftsmen, and religious specialists to Babylon had created a crisis of expertise that made effective governance nearly impossible even in territories that remained under nominal Elamite control. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the former Elamite Empire reveals the extent of social and economic disruption that characterized the early centuries of this dark period. Urban centers that had flourished during the Middle Elamite period show clear signs of abandonment or dramatic population decline. The sophisticated craft workshops that had produced the luxury goods which funded imperial expansion ceased operation, while the commercial networks that had connected Elamite territories with markets throughout the ancient Near East collapsed completely. Yet despite this apparent catastrophe, Elamite civilization demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to drastically changed circumstances. Rather than simply disappearing as conquered peoples often did in the ancient world, Elamite communities throughout the Iranian highlands began developing new forms of political and social organization that could function effectively without the centralized imperial institutions that Babylonian conquest had destroyed. These adaptations drew on traditional highland cultural patterns that had persisted beneath the imperial structures of the Middle Elamite period. The political fragmentation that characterized the silent centuries represented more than simple governmental collapse. It reflected a return to older forms of Elamite social organization based on kinship groups, tribal confederations, and regional loyalties that could maintain cohesion and identity without requiring the complex administrative apparatus that imperial rule had demanded. These smaller political units were more flexible and resilient than the centralized empire had been, better able to survive external pressures and internal difficulties while preserving essential elements of Elamite cultural identity. The limited written sources that survive from this period suggest that multiple competing dynasties emerged in different parts of the former Elamite territory, each claiming legitimacy as the heir to the imperial tradition while actually controlling only small portions of the highlands. These rival kingdoms maintained many of the religious and cultural practices that had characterized earlier Elamite civilization, but they lacked the resources and coordination necessary for large-scale military campaigns or major construction projects. The survival strategies that Elamite communities developed during the silent centuries revealed creative adaptations to the harsh realities of reduced circumstances. Highland settlements that had previously depended on imperial redistribution systems learned to become more self-sufficient, developing local craft specializations and agricultural techniques that could support their populations without external support. Trading relationships that had once been coordinated by imperial administrators were reconstituted on smaller scales through personal and kinship networks that proved more durable than formal governmental institutions. Religious continuity provided crucial stability during this period of political fragmentation. The cults of traditional Elamite deities continued to function in highland temples and sacred sites, even when the royal patronage that had supported them during the imperial period was no longer available. These religious institutions served not only spiritual needs, but also practical functions as centers of community organization, repositories of traditional knowledge, and focal points for maintaining cultural identity across political boundaries. The role of tribal leadership became increasingly important as centralized royal authority weakened and disappeared. Traditional highland chiefs who had been subordinated to imperial administrators during the Middle Elamite period now emerged as the primary sources of political authority in their regions. These leaders possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions and traditional relationships that made them more effective governors than external appointees could have been, while their authority was legitimized by customary practices that predated imperial conquest. Archaeological evidence suggests that some regions maintained higher levels of political organization and cultural sophistication than others during the silent centuries. Areas that had been less fully integrated into the imperial system during the Middle Elamite period often suffered less disruption and recovered more quickly than territories that had been more thoroughly transformed by imperial policies. The diversity of recovery patterns reflects the complex relationship between imperial integration and local resilience that would influence Elamite development for centuries to come. The gradual recovery that began during the later centuries of this period was facilitated by changes in the broader regional political environment that reduced external pressures on Elamite territories. Babylonian power declined significantly after Nebuchadnezzar's death as internal succession disputes and economic difficulties undermined the governmental efficiency that had made his conquests possible. This Babylonian weakness created opportunities for Elamite communities to rebuild without facing immediate threats of renewed invasion or conquest. The emergence of Assyrian power in northern Mesopotamia during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE paradoxically contributed to Elamite recovery by creating new strategic situations that made Elamite cooperation valuable to various Mesopotamian powers. As Assyrian expansion threatened both Babylonian independence and the autonomy of smaller Mesopotamian states, these threatened powers began seeking alliances with any available forces that could help resist Assyrian conquest. Elamite highland kingdoms, despite their reduced circumstances, possessed military capabilities and strategic positions that made them attractive partners for anti-Assyrian coalitions. The limited documentary evidence that begins to appear during the later Silent centuries suggests that some Elamite rulers were learning to exploit these new diplomatic opportunities skillfully. Rather than attempting to restore the imperial dominance that their predecessors had enjoyed, these pragmatic leaders focused on maximizing the advantages that their strategic position provided while avoiding the overextension that had contributed to earlier disasters. This more modest approach to regional politics would become a characteristic feature of Neo-Elamite diplomacy. Cultural developments during the Silent centuries laid important foundations for the artistic and intellectual achievements that would characterize the later recovery period. The forced isolation from Mesopotamian cultural influences that resulted from political fragmentation encouraged the development of distinctively Elamite artistic and literary traditions that drew more heavily on indigenous highland cultural patterns. While the cosmopolitan sophistication of the imperial period was lost, the cultural authenticity that emerged during these difficult centuries would provide important sources of strength for later Elamite revival. The technological innovations that Elamite communities developed during the Silent centuries reflected their adaptation to reduced resources and increased self-reliance. Metallurgical techniques were simplified and standardized to make them more accessible to smaller workshops, while agricultural practices were modified to maximize productivity in highland environments without requiring the large-scale irrigation systems that imperial governments had maintained. These practical adaptations increased the overall resilience of Elamite society while reducing its dependence on centralized coordination. By 750 BCE, when clearer historical records begin to emerge again, the Elamite world had been fundamentally transformed by the experiences of the Silent centuries. The unified empire that had once challenged Babylon for regional dominance had been replaced by a collection of highland kingdoms that were individually weak but collectively resilient. The imperial ambitions that had characterized Middle Elamite policy had been replaced by more modest goals focused on survival and gradual recovery rather than conquest and expansion. Most importantly, the survival strategies that Elamite communities had developed during these difficult centuries had created new forms of political organization and cultural identity that would prove remarkably effective in dealing with the challenges that the emerging Assyrian threat would soon present. The flexibility, resilience, and pragmatic realism that characterized Neo-Elamite civilization were direct products of the adaptations that had been necessary for survival during the Silent centuries. Around 750 BCE, as the scattered Elamite kingdoms were slowly emerging from their centuries of recovery and political fragmentation, a new and unprecedented threat began to dominate the political landscape of the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire, centered in northern Mesopotamia, was transforming itself from a regional power into the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen. Under a succession of ruthless and capable kings, Assyria was developing new approaches to warfare, conquest, and imperial administration that would challenge every assumption about political survival that Elamite rulers had learned during their long history of competition with Mesopotamian powers. The Assyrian threat differed fundamentally from any challenge that Elamite civilization had previously faced. Earlier Mesopotamian empires, even at their height, had typically pursued limited objectives focused on controlling specific territories, trade routes, or tributary relationships. The Assyrians, by contrast, were creating a totalitarian imperial system designed to achieve permanent conquest and cultural assimilation of subject populations throughout the entire known world. Their ultimate goal was nothing less than universal empire, and their methods were systematic enough to make this seemingly impossible ambition appear achievable. The military innovations that made Assyrian expansion so dangerous were unprecedented in their scope and effectiveness. Assyrian armies were not merely larger than their contemporaries. They were organized according to entirely new principles that maximized the advantages of professional military service, standardized equipment, and coordinated tactical procedures. Assyrian military engineers had developed siege techniques that could overcome virtually any fortification, while Assyrian logistics specialists had created supply systems that could sustain massive armies during extended campaigns across hostile territory. Perhaps most ominously for potential enemies, the Assyrians had systematized the use of terror as a tool of conquest and control. Unlike earlier empires that had typically been content to defeat enemy armies and establish tributary relationships, the Assyrians deliberately employed mass deportations, systematic destruction of urban centers, and calculated brutality against civilian populations to eliminate any possibility of future resistance. These methods proved devastatingly effective in breaking the will of subject peoples while providing powerful incentives for unconquered territories to submit without resistance. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled Assyria from 744 to 727 BCE, marked the beginning of systematic Assyrian expansion that would eventually threaten Elamite independence. Tiglath-Pileser's administrative and military reforms created the institutional foundations for sustained imperial expansion, while his campaigns established Assyrian control over much of northern and central Mesopotamia. More importantly for Elamite interests, his successes encouraged Assyrian strategic thinking that viewed the conquest of the Iranian highlands as a logical next step in the creation of universal empire. The initial Assyrian campaigns that brought them into contact with Elamite territories revealed both the effectiveness of Assyrian military methods and the limitations of traditional Elamite defensive strategies. The highland warfare techniques that had served Elamite forces so well against earlier Mesopotamian armies proved less effective against Assyrian forces that combined superior organization with innovative tactics specifically designed for mountain warfare. Assyrian military engineers had studied the challenges of highland combat and developed specialized equipment and procedures that neutralized many of the traditional advantages that mountain defenders had enjoyed. The fragmented political structure that had emerged during the Silent Centuries, while providing resilience against certain types of threats, proved poorly adapted to coordinating effective resistance against Assyrian expansion. Individual Elamite kingdoms lacked the resources necessary to mount serious opposition to Assyrian armies, while the personal and kinship networks that had replaced imperial administrative systems were inadequate for organizing large-scale military cooperation between different regions and tribal groups. Sargon II, who succeeded Tiglath-Pileser as Assyrian king, intensified the pressure on Elamite territories through campaigns that demonstrated the full range of Assyrian military capabilities. Sargon's forces proved equally effective in mountain warfare and siege operations, while his administrative policies showed that Assyrian conquest was intended to achieve permanent integration of conquered territories rather than temporary tribute relationships. The systematic deportation of local elites and the replacement of traditional governmental structures with Assyrian administrative procedures left little doubt about Assyrian intentions regarding Elamite independence. The Elamite response to mounting Assyrian pressure required fundamental changes in political organization and strategic thinking that challenged traditional highland cultural patterns. The kinship-based leadership that had served Elamite communities well during the recovery period lacked the authority and resources necessary for coordinating kingdom-wide resistance efforts. New forms of political cooperation had to be developed that could unite diverse Elamite groups without recreating the centralized imperial structures that had proven vulnerable to external conquest. The emergence of what historians call the Neo-Elamite Confederacy represented an innovative solution to these political challenges. Rather than attempting to restore traditional royal authority, Elamite leaders created flexible alliance networks that could coordinate military and diplomatic activities while preserving the autonomy that local communities had come to value during the silent centuries. These confederate arrangements allowed for rapid mobilization of resources when external threats required unified responses while maintaining the political diversity that had proven essential for long-term survival. The diplomatic strategies that Neo-Elamite leaders developed for dealing with Assyrian expansion demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the complex relationships between the various powers that were threatened by Assyrian conquest. Rather than attempting to resist Assyrian expansion independently, Elamite diplomats systematically cultivated relationships with other threatened powers, including Babylonian city-states, Syrian kingdoms, and even distant powers like Egypt that shared interests in limiting Assyrian success. These diplomatic initiatives required unprecedented sophistication in managing relationships with multiple partners whose interests only partially overlapped with Elamite concerns. Babylonian city-states wanted Elamite military support for maintaining their independence, but were reluctant to provide reciprocal assistance for defending Elamite territory. Syrian kingdoms sought Elamite cooperation in disrupting Assyrian supply lines, but could offer little direct military assistance in return. Egyptian rulers were interested in any activities that might weaken Assyrian power, but were too distant to provide meaningful support for Elamite defensive efforts. The military adaptations that Elamite forces developed for resisting Assyrian expansion reflected careful study of Assyrian methods, combined with creative exploitation of highland geographic advantages that Assyrian armies had not yet learned to overcome completely. Elamite military leaders recognized that direct battlefield confrontations with Assyrian forces were likely to result in defeat, so they developed guerrilla warfare techniques that could inflict significant casualties on Assyrian armies while avoiding the concentrated engagements that Assyrian tactical superiority would dominate. These new military approaches required significant changes in traditional Elamite warrior culture and military organization. The individual heroism and personal combat skills that had characterized highland warfare for centuries were less important than the discipline and coordination necessary for effective guerrilla operations. Elamite military leaders had to develop new training procedures, command structures, and logistical systems that could support unconventional warfare while maintaining the morale and cohesion necessary for sustained resistance. The economic strategies that Neo-Elamite kingdoms developed for supporting their resistance efforts demonstrated remarkable innovation in adapting limited resources to meet unprecedented challenges. Traditional highland economic activities were reorganized to prioritize military needs while maintaining sufficient agricultural and craft production to support civilian populations. New commercial relationships were established with distant partners who could provide military supplies and strategic materials without requiring transit through Assyrian-controlled territories. Religious and cultural developments during this period reflected the existential challenge that Assyrian expansion posed to Elamite civilization. Traditional highland religious practices were adapted to emphasize themes of resistance and survival, while cultural institutions that had preserved Elamite identity during the silent centuries were mobilized to maintain morale and unity during increasingly difficult military and political circumstances. The highland sanctuaries that had served as centers of community organization now became focal points for coordinating resistance activities. The intelligence networks that Elamite leaders created for monitoring Assyrian activities and coordinating with potential allies represented some of the most sophisticated espionage operations in the ancient world. Elamite agents established themselves in Assyrian-controlled territories, Babylonian cities, and Syrian kingdoms to gather information about Assyrian plans while facilitating communication between the various groups that were attempting to resist Assyrian expansion. These intelligence activities required unprecedented cooperation between different Elamite regions and demonstrated the Confederate system's capacity for complex coordination when circumstances required unified action. By 650 BCE, the Assyrian threat had transformed Elamite society in ways that would have seemed impossible during the height of the Middle Elamite Empire. The confident imperial power that had once conquered Babylon had become a collection of highland communities united primarily by their shared determination to avoid Assyrian conquest. Yet, this transformation had also created new sources of strength that would prove crucial for Elamite survival in the increasingly dangerous world that Assyrian expansion was creating. Around 722 BCE, the complex diplomatic strategies that Neo-Elamite leaders had been developing to counter Assyrian expansion found their most dramatic expression in a remarkable alliance with one of the most resourceful and persistent opponents of Assyrian rule in Mesopotamian history. Merodach-Baladan, a Chaldean tribal leader who had established himself as king of Babylon, represented exactly the kind of partner that Elamite strategists had been seeking. A capable military leader with strong local support, control over strategically important territory, and an uncompromising commitment to resisting Assyrian conquest that matched their own determination to preserve Elamite independence. The alliance between Shutruk-Nahhunte II, who had emerged as the leading figure in the Neo-Elamite Confederacy, and Merodach-Baladan created one of the most effective anti-Assyrian coalitions of the 8th century BCE. This partnership combined Elamite military capabilities and highland strategic advantages with Babylonian resources and Mesopotamian political legitimacy in ways that posed serious challenges to Assyrian expansion plans. More importantly, it demonstrated that creative diplomacy and coordinated resistance could still achieve significant results against even the most formidable imperial power. Merodach-Baladan's rise to power in Babylon had been facilitated by the same conditions that were forcing Elamite political evolution. Assyrian pressure on traditional Mesopotamian governmental structures had created opportunities for innovative leaders who could offer alternative approaches to political organization and military resistance. As a Chaldean tribal chief, Merodach-Baladan possessed both the personal authority necessary for effective leadership and the flexibility to adapt traditional political methods to meet unprecedented challenges. The strategic vision that brought Shutruk-Nahhunte and Merodach-Baladan together reflected sophisticated understanding of the regional balance of power and the limitations that both leaders faced in their individual resistance efforts. Neither Elam nor Babylonia possessed sufficient resources to challenge Assyrian dominance independently, but their combined capabilities created possibilities for effective opposition that neither could achieve alone. The alliance represented a calculated gamble that coordinated resistance might succeed where individual defiance had repeatedly failed. The practical implementation of Elamite-Babylonian cooperation required unprecedented coordination between very different political and military systems. Elamite confederate structures emphasized flexibility and local autonomy, while Babylonian governmental traditions focused on centralized royal authority and formal administrative procedures. Creating effective working relationships between these disparate approaches to governance and military organization required diplomatic innovation and mutual accommodation that tested the adaptability of both political systems. The military cooperation that developed between Elamite and Babylonian forces during this period demonstrated remarkable tactical creativity in exploiting the geographic and political advantages that their alliance provided. Elamite troops could use their highland bases to launch raids against Assyrian supply lines and communication networks, while Babylonian forces defended urban centers and maintained control over the agricultural resources that sustained anti-Assyrian resistance. This division of military responsibilities maximized the effectiveness of both partners while minimizing the vulnerabilities that had made earlier resistance efforts unsuccessful. The intelligence networks that the alliance created for monitoring Assyrian activities and coordinating resistance operations were among the most sophisticated espionage systems in the ancient world. Elamite agents operating in Assyrian-controlled territories could provide advance warning of military campaigns, while Babylonian contacts throughout Mesopotamia facilitated communication between different resistance groups and helped coordinate timing for maximum effectiveness. These intelligence capabilities gave the alliance significant advantages in planning defensive strategies and offensive operations. The financial and logistical support that Elam provided for Babylonian resistance efforts represented a major commitment of resources that strained Neo-Elamite capabilities, but proved essential for maintaining effective opposition to Assyrian conquest. Elamite highland territories provided secure bases where Babylonian forces could retreat when Assyrian pressure became overwhelming, while Elamite commercial networks supplied weapons, equipment, and other military necessities that Babylonian production capabilities could not provide independently. The propaganda warfare that accompanied these military and political activities demonstrated both partners' understanding of the psychological dimensions of their struggle against Assyrian dominance. Merodach-Baladan's successful maintenance of Babylonian independence for over a decade provided powerful symbolic challenges to Assyrian claims of inevitable victory, while Elamite support for this resistance demonstrated that Assyrian expansion could still be effectively opposed by determined and well-coordinated enemies. Sargon II's response to the Elamite-Babylonian alliance revealed both the seriousness with which Assyrian leadership viewed this threat and the limitations that even Assyrian military superiority faced when confronting well-coordinated opposition. Sargon's campaigns against the alliance required unprecedented resource commitments and demonstrated that Assyrian conquest was not the inevitable process that Assyrian propaganda claimed. The alliance's ability to maintain effective resistance for over 2 decades proved that creative diplomacy and coordinated military action could still achieve meaningful results against imperial expansion. The economic warfare that became an important component of the alliance's anti-Assyrian strategy exploited the commercial relationships and trade networks that both partners had developed during their respective periods of independence. Disruption of Assyrian commercial activities and interference with tribute collection from conquered territories created significant financial pressures that complemented the military challenges that coordinated resistance operations presented to Assyrian administrative efficiency. The diplomatic initiatives that Shutruk-Nahhunte and Merodach-Baladan pursued with other potential allies demonstrated their understanding that successful resistance to Assyrian expansion required broader international cooperation than their bilateral alliance could provide. Contacts with Egyptian rulers, Syrian kingdoms, and Anatolian powers created possibilities for multi-front conflicts that would strain Assyrian capabilities while providing additional resources and strategic options for anti-Assyrian resistance. The cultural and religious dimensions of the alliance reflected both leaders' recognition that effective long-term resistance required ideological foundations that could sustain morale and unity during prolonged conflicts. The restoration of traditional Babylonian religious practices and the preservation of Elamite cultural identity became important symbols of what the alliance was fighting to preserve against Assyrian policies of cultural assimilation and political integration. The succession of military campaigns that characterized the alliance period demonstrated both the effectiveness of coordinated resistance and the enormous costs that sustained opposition to Assyrian expansion required. Elamite and Babylonian forces achieved several significant tactical victories that disrupted Assyrian expansion plans and demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated imperial military systems. However, these successes came at enormous costs in human casualties and material resources that neither partner could sustain indefinitely. The internal political challenges that both partners faced in maintaining their alliance while managing their domestic responsibilities revealed the complexity of resistance politics during this period. Elamite confederate structures required constant negotiation and accommodation between different regional groups, whose commitment to anti-Assyrian resistance varied depending on their immediate circumstances. Babylonian support for Merodach-Baladan's policies depended on his ability to demonstrate concrete benefits from Elamite cooperation while managing the economic and social disruptions that prolonged warfare created. The technological and tactical innovations that emerged from Elamite-Babylonian military cooperation influenced the development of warfare throughout the ancient Near East. Combined operations that coordinated highland guerrilla tactics with urban siege defense created new approaches to military strategy that would influence later resistance movements. The intelligence and communication systems that the alliance developed established precedents for international cooperation that would prove valuable for future diplomatic initiatives. The diplomatic protocols that Shutruk-Nahhunte and Merodach-Baladan established for managing their complex relationship created institutional frameworks that could survive temporary setbacks and changing circumstances. Regular consultations, standardized procedures for military coordination, and formal mechanisms for resolving disputes ensured that the alliance could maintain effectiveness even when immediate military situations created pressures for independent action. By 703 BCE, when changing political circumstances began to strain the foundations of Elamite-Babylonian cooperation, the alliance had achieved remarkable success in demonstrating that creative diplomacy and coordinated resistance could still challenge imperial expansion even under the most difficult circumstances. The partnership between Shutruk-Nahhunte and Merodach-Baladan had provided both kingdoms with over 2 decades of effective opposition to Assyrian conquest while establishing precedents for international cooperation that would influence regional politics for generations. However, the very success of their resistance efforts had also attracted intensified Assyrian attention and convinced Assyrian leadership that more systematic and ruthless approaches would be necessary to eliminate the threat that coordinated opposition represented to imperial expansion plans. The stage was now set for a new phase of Assyrian-Elamite conflict that would test everything the alliance had accomplished and determine whether the innovative strategies they had developed could survive the full application of Assyrian military power. When Sennacherib ascended to the Assyrian throne in 705 BCE, the long-standing conflict between Assyria and the Elamite-Babylonian alliance entered a new and far more destructive phase. Unlike his father, Sargon II, who had pursued Assyrian expansion through systematic but relatively measured campaigns, Sennacherib brought to the conflict a personal vindictiveness and strategic ruthlessness that would transform the nature of ancient Near Eastern warfare. His reign would be characterized by an escalating spiral of violence that pushed both Assyrian and Elamite military capabilities to their absolute limits while devastating the territories and populations caught between these competing imperial powers. Sennacherib's approach to the Elamite problem reflected fundamental changes in Assyrian strategic thinking that had emerged from 2 decades of frustrating resistance by the Shutruk-Nahhunte and Merodach-Baladan alliance. Previous Assyrian rulers had typically viewed military campaigns as instruments for achieving specific political objectives: territorial conquest, tribute extraction, or diplomatic intimidation. Sennacherib, by contrast, came to see the systematic destruction of enemy capabilities as an end in itself, believing that only the complete elimination of Elamite power could ensure permanent Assyrian security. This shift toward total warfare had profound implications for how conflicts would be conducted and what constraints would govern military activities. Traditional ancient Near Eastern warfare had operated according to informal but widely recognized limitations that protected certain categories of non-combatants, preserved essential economic infrastructure, and maintained diplomatic channels that could facilitate negotiated settlements. Sennacherib's campaigns systematically violated these conventional restrictions in pursuit of objectives that went far beyond normal territorial or political goals. The military innovations that Sennacherib introduced to prosecute his war against Elam reflected the new strategic priorities that governed his approach to imperial expansion. Assyrian armies under his command were equipped not just for battlefield victory, but for systematic destruction of enemy society and economy. Specialized units were trained for demolishing irrigation systems, destroying urban infrastructure, and conducting mass deportations that would eliminate the human resources necessary for future resistance. These capabilities represented qualitative advances in the technology of conquest that made Sennacherib's forces far more dangerous than any previous Assyrian armies. The Elamite response to this escalation revealed both the resilience and the limitations of the Confederate political system that had emerged during the Neo-Elamite period. Dur-Untash in Shushinak, who had succeeded Shutruk-Nahhunte as the leading figure in Elamite resistance, understood that traditional defensive strategies would be inadequate against the total warfare that Sennacherib was conducting. His adaptation to these new conditions required fundamental changes in Elamite military organization and strategic thinking that pushed highland society far beyond its normal capabilities. The guerrilla warfare techniques that Elamite forces developed during this period represented significant innovations in irregular military operations that would influence the conduct of asymmetric conflicts for centuries to come. Rather than attempting to defend fixed positions against overwhelmingly superior Assyrian forces, Elamite commanders created mobile strike forces that could appear suddenly to attack Assyrian supply lines, communication networks, and isolated garrisons before disappearing into mountain terrain where Assyrian pursuit would be difficult or impossible. These tactical adaptations required unprecedented coordination between different Elamite regions and tribal groups that had traditionally maintained their autonomy, even during periods of external threat. The Confederate political structures that had served the Neo-Elamite kingdoms well during earlier conflicts proved barely adequate for managing the total mobilization that effective resistance to Sennacherib's campaigns required. New forms of military authority had to be created that could override local autonomy when strategic necessity demanded unified action. The logistical challenges that both sides faced during this intensified phase of conflict pushed ancient warfare to new levels of sophistication and brutality. Sennacherib's armies required enormous quantities of supplies and equipment to maintain their effectiveness during extended campaigns in hostile territory, while Elamite forces needed to sustain their operations without access to the urban centers and agricultural regions that Assyrian conquest had eliminated or threatened. Both sides developed innovative solutions to these challenges that demonstrated remarkable adaptability under extreme pressure. The intelligence warfare that characterized this period revealed the extent to which both Assyrian and Elamite leadership understood the importance of information and psychological operations in determining the outcome of their struggle. Sennacherib's forces employed systematic terror tactics designed not just to eliminate immediate resistance but to discourage future opposition by demonstrating the consequences of defying Assyrian authority. Elamite responses included propaganda operations designed to undermine Assyrian morale while encouraging resistance movements in conquered territories. The economic warfare that became an increasingly important component of the conflict demonstrated both sides' recognition that military victory alone would be insufficient to achieve their ultimate objectives. Sennacherib's systematic destruction of Elamite commercial networks and productive capabilities was designed to eliminate the economic foundations that supported Elamite resistance, while Elamite disruption of Assyrian tribute collection and trade relationships was intended to create financial pressures that would force Assyrian withdrawal from overextended positions. The technological competition that emerged from this intensified conflict accelerated developments in military engineering, siege warfare, and defensive architecture throughout the ancient Near East. Assyrian siege techniques became more sophisticated and destructive as engineers developed new methods for overcoming Elamite fortifications, while Elamite defensive innovations created new challenges that required corresponding Assyrian adaptations. This technological arms race consumed enormous resources while producing innovations that would influence military development for generations. The diplomatic dimensions of the conflict became increasingly complex as both sides sought allies and attempted to deny potential partners to their enemies. Sennacherib's campaigns against Elamite allies in Babylonia and Syria were designed not just to eliminate immediate threats, but to isolate Elam diplomatically by demonstrating the futility of opposing Assyrian power. Elamite diplomatic initiatives focused on encouraging resistance movements throughout the Assyrian Empire while seeking support from distant powers that shared interests in limiting Assyrian expansion. The religious and cultural warfare that accompanied military operations reflected both sides' understanding that legitimacy and morale were crucial factors in determining the outcome of prolonged conflicts. Sennacherib's systematic destruction of Elamite temples and sacred sites was intended to demonstrate the powerlessness of Elamite gods while breaking the spiritual foundations of Elamite resistance. Elamite responses included religious ceremonies and cultural activities designed to maintain highland identity and spiritual cohesion despite unprecedented external pressures. The human costs of this escalating conflict were catastrophic for both societies. Assyrian casualties from sustained campaigning in difficult terrain with determined opposition significantly exceeded losses from earlier expansion campaigns, while Elamite losses from military action, economic disruption, and systematic destruction threatened the demographic foundations of highland society. These enormous sacrifices created political pressures in both kingdoms that complicated strategic decision-making and forced both leaders to consider whether continued conflict served their fundamental interests. The environmental destruction that resulted from systematic warfare created long-term problems that would influence regional development for centuries. The deliberate destruction of irrigation systems, deforestation for military purposes, and disruption of traditional agricultural practices created ecological damage that reduced the carrying capacity of territories throughout the conflict zone. These environmental consequences represented hidden costs of intensified warfare that would burden future generations, regardless of which side ultimately achieved victory. The administrative challenges that both kingdoms faced in maintaining effective governance while conducting total warfare pushed governmental capabilities to their breaking points. Assyrian administrative systems struggled to coordinate the complex logistics of extended campaigns while managing the domestic resources necessary for sustained military effort. Elamite confederate structures found it increasingly difficult to balance the demands of military coordination with the local autonomy that highland communities considered essential for their cooperation. By 691 BCE, the escalating spiral of violence that had characterized Sennacherib's approach to the Elamite conflict had created conditions that made some form of decisive confrontation inevitable. Both sides had invested enormous resources in their struggle while inflicting devastating damage on each other's capabilities, but neither had achieved the decisive advantage that would allow them to impose a satisfactory resolution. The stage was set for a climactic battle that would test everything both empires had learned about warfare while determining whether Elamite independence could survive the full application of Assyrian military power. The mutual exhaustion that both kingdoms were approaching made it clear that the next major engagement might well determine the future of both civilizations, as neither possessed the resources necessary for indefinite continuation of the destructive conflict that Sennacherib's fury had unleashed upon the ancient world. The ancient world had never witnessed anything quite like the massive confrontation that took place near the Mesopotamian city of Hulul in 691 BCE. For over a decade, the escalating conflict between Sennacherib's Assyrian Empire and the Elamite-led coalition had been building toward a decisive showdown that would test the ultimate capabilities of both military systems. When the armies finally met on the plains near Hulul, the resulting battle would prove to be one of the largest and most destructive military engagements in ancient Near Eastern history, involving tens of thousands of combatants in a single day of fighting that would exhaust both empires and fundamentally alter the trajectory of regional politics. The coalition that faced Sennacherib's forces at Hulul represented the culmination of decades of Elamite diplomatic efforts to create effective resistance to Assyrian expansion. Under the leadership of Humban-Nimena, who had emerged as the most capable Elamite military commander of his generation, the coalition brought together not only the highland warriors who formed the core of Elamite resistance, but also Babylonian forces under Mushezib-Marduk, the latest in the succession of anti-Assyrian rulers who had maintained Babylonian independence through Elamite support. This alliance had been supplemented by contingents from various other groups throughout the region who shared interests in preventing complete Assyrian domination. The strategic situation that led to the Halul confrontation reflected the failure of both sides to achieve decisive victory through their previous campaigns. Sennacherib's systematic destruction of Elamite territories had inflicted enormous damage but had not eliminated Elamite military capabilities or broken the will to resist that sustained highland opposition. Similarly, Elamite guerrilla operations and diplomatic initiatives had disrupted Assyrian expansion plans and imposed significant costs on imperial resources, but had not forced Assyrian withdrawal from conquered territories or abandoned imperial ambitions. The immediate catalyst for the battle came from Mushezib-Marduk's decision to launch a major offensive aimed at recapturing Babylonian territory that had fallen under Assyrian control during earlier campaigns. This Babylonian initiative created an opportunity for Humban-Nimena to coordinate a massive Elamite military intervention that would catch Assyrian forces between two hostile armies while they were engaged in siege operations against fortified Babylonian positions. The timing and coordination required for this complex operation demonstrated the sophisticated military planning capabilities that the coalition had developed through years of cooperation. The size of the armies that converged near Haluli was unprecedented in ancient Near Eastern warfare. Assyrian sources claim that Sennacherib's forces numbered over 100,000 men, including not only Assyrian troops but also contingents from various subject peoples throughout the empire who had been pressed into service for this crucial campaign. The coalition army was somewhat smaller, but still represented the largest concentration of anti-Assyrian forces that had ever been assembled, with Elamite Highland warriors forming the core around which Babylonian troops and various allied contingents were organized. The tactical challenges that both commanders faced in controlling such massive forces exceeded anything that ancient military leaders had previously encountered. Traditional command and control methods that worked effectively with armies numbering in the thousands proved inadequate for coordinating the complex maneuvers that tens of thousands of troops required. Both sides had to develop new systems of military communication and battlefield coordination that pushed ancient organizational capabilities to their absolute limits. The battle itself began before dawn, as both armies attempted to seize advantageous positions on the relatively flat terrain near Halul. The geographic features of the battlefield favored neither side significantly, creating conditions where victory would depend primarily on military skill, organizational effectiveness, and the ability to maintain coordination under extreme combat stress. The lack of major defensive advantages meant that both armies would be forced to rely on their tactical capabilities rather than geographic protection. The opening phases of the battle revealed the tactical innovations that both sides had developed through years of intensive warfare. Assyrian forces attempted to use their superior organization and standardized equipment to create overwhelming pressure at key points in the coalition battle line, while coalition commanders sought to exploit their superior knowledge of local conditions and the tactical flexibility that their diverse force composition provided. The resulting combat was characterized by a series of coordinated attacks and counterattacks that tested the endurance and skill of every unit involved. The role of Elamite Highland warriors proved crucial during the most intense phases of the fighting. Their traditional expertise in irregular warfare translated effectively to battlefield conditions where rigid formations were disrupted by the chaos of mass combat. Elamite units demonstrated remarkable ability to maintain cohesion and effectiveness, even when their original tactical formations were broken by the pressure of prolonged fighting. This tactical resilience provided the coalition with advantages that partially compensated for Assyrian superiority in equipment and organization. The participation of Babylonian forces under Mushezib-Marduk added important capabilities that neither Elamite nor Assyrian forces could match individually. Babylonian siege specialists and engineers brought technical expertise that proved valuable in the complex urban warfare that characterized parts of the battle, while Babylonian knowledge of local terrain and political conditions provided strategic advantages that purely Highland or imperial forces could not achieve independently. The climactic phase of the battle occurred during the midday hours when both armies committed their reserve forces in desperate attempts to achieve decisive breakthrough. The fighting during this period reached levels of intensity and destruction that exceeded anything recorded in previous ancient battles. Assyrian royal inscriptions describe scenes of carnage that left the battlefield littered with thousands of casualties, while coalition sources emphasize the heroic resistance that prevented Assyrian victory despite overwhelming odds. The controversial outcome of the Battle of Halul reflected the unprecedented scale and intensity of the fighting that had exhausted both armies without producing clear tactical victory for either side. Assyrian sources claimed decisive victory based on their ability to maintain control of the battlefield and their success in preventing coalition forces from achieving their immediate objectives. Coalition sources, by contrast, claimed victory based on their success in preventing Assyrian breakthrough and forcing Sennacherib to abandon his campaign objectives, despite deploying the largest army in Assyrian history. The strategic consequences of the battle became apparent in the months following the engagement as both sides struggled to recover from the enormous casualties and resource expenditures that the fighting had required. Sennacherib's forces, despite their claimed victory, proved unable to exploit their battlefield success to achieve lasting strategic gains. The coalition armies, though forced to withdraw from their advanced positions, retained sufficient strength to continue effective resistance operations that prevented Assyrian consolidation of territorial gains. The human costs of the Battle of Halul were catastrophic for both sides and represented a qualitative escalation in the destructiveness of ancient warfare. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites throughout both empires suggests that casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, including many of the most experienced military leaders and veteran troops, whose loss would compromise future military effectiveness. These demographic impacts created political and military challenges that would influence both empires for decades. The technological lessons learned during the battle influenced military development throughout the ancient Near East as commanders and military engineers analyzed the tactical innovations and equipment modifications that had proven effective under extreme combat conditions. The coordination challenges that both sides had faced led to important advances in military communication systems and battlefield organization that would be adopted by later armies throughout the region. The diplomatic implications of the battle's inconclusive outcome forced both sides to reconsider their strategic assumptions and explore alternative approaches to achieving their fundamental objectives. The demonstration that even the largest and most sophisticated military forces could not guarantee decisive victory created incentives for both empires to seek negotiated solutions that might preserve their essential interests without requiring continued massive military expenditures. The propaganda warfare that followed the battle as both sides attempted to claim victory revealed the political importance that rulers throughout the ancient world attached to maintaining prestige and legitimacy through military success. The conflicting narratives that emerged from Halul would influence historical memory and political rhetoric throughout the region, while providing later historians with valuable insights into how ancient peoples understood the relationship between military achievement and political authority. By the end of 691 BCE, it had become clear that the Battle of Halul represented a turning point in the long conflict between Assyria and Elam. Neither side had achieved the decisive victory that would have allowed them to impose their will completely on their opponents, but both had demonstrated that they possessed the military capabilities necessary to inflict unacceptable costs on any enemy who challenged their fundamental interests. The stage was set for a new phase of the conflict, in which both empires would be forced to operate within the constraints imposed by their mutual exhaustion, while continuing to compete for regional dominance through means that neither could sustain indefinitely. The mutual exhaustion that had characterized the aftermath of Halul created a deceptive period of reduced hostilities that lasted for nearly 3 decades. However, this apparent respite in Assyrian-Elamite conflict was terminated with devastating finality when Ashurbanipal ascended to the Assyrian throne in 668 BCE. Unlike his predecessors, who had pursued Elamite conquest as one objective among many competing imperial priorities, Ashurbanipal developed an obsessive determination to achieve the complete and permanent destruction of Elamite power that would consume the final decades of his reign and ultimately succeed in eliminating Elam as an independent political entity forever. Ashurbanipal's approach to the Elamite problem reflected both personal motivations and strategic calculations that differed fundamentally from earlier Assyrian policies. Where Sennacherib had sought to defeat Elamite resistance through superior military force, Ashurbanipal pursued systematic cultural and political annihilation designed to eliminate not just Elamite military capabilities, but the very foundations of Elamite civilization. His campaigns represented perhaps the most thorough attempt at civilizational destruction in ancient Near Eastern history, employing methods that went far beyond traditional warfare to achieve objectives that previous conquerors had never contemplated. The immediate trigger for Ashurbanipal's final assault on Elam came from succession disputes within the Elamite Confederacy that created opportunities for Assyrian intervention. Te'uman, who had emerged as the dominant Elamite leader following the death of earlier resistance commanders, faced challenges from rival claimants whose political maneuvering provided Ashurbanipal with pretexts for military action and potential collaborators who might facilitate Assyrian conquest. The internal divisions that had always been a source of Elamite political flexibility now became vulnerabilities that skilled Assyrian diplomacy could exploit. The military machine that Ashurbanipal assembled for his Elamite campaigns represented the culmination of centuries of Assyrian military development and organizational refinement. His armies combined all the tactical innovations and technological advances that previous Assyrian rulers had developed, while adding new capabilities specifically designed for the systematic destruction of enemy society and culture. These forces were equipped not merely for battlefield victory, but for the comprehensive elimination of everything that made Elamite civilization distinctive and viable. The intelligence preparation that preceded Ashurbanipal's campaigns demonstrated unprecedented sophistication in gathering and analyzing information about enemy capabilities, political divisions, and strategic vulnerabilities. Assyrian agents had spent years infiltrating Elamite territories, mapping defensive positions, identifying key infrastructure targets, and cultivating potential collaborators who could facilitate conquest operations. This intelligence foundation gave Ashurbanipal detailed knowledge of Elamite strengths and weaknesses that no previous Assyrian commander had possessed. The psychological warfare that accompanied Ashurbanipal's military preparations was designed to break Elamite will to resist before the main campaigns even began. Assyrian propaganda emphasized not just the futility of opposing Assyrian power, but the complete destruction that awaited any territory that dared to maintain independence. These psychological operations combined threats of unprecedented destruction with promises of mercy for early submission, creating internal pressures within Elamite society that complicated defensive preparations and undermined political unity. The systematic nature of Ashurbanipal's assault on Elamite territory represented a qualitative escalation in the destructiveness of ancient warfare that established new precedents for imperial conquest. Rather than advancing directly toward primary objectives, Assyrian forces methodically destroyed every element of Elamite infrastructure and political organization they encountered. Towns, villages, irrigation systems, temples, administrative centers, and transportation networks were all systematically eliminated in a campaign designed to make future recovery impossible. The siege and destruction of Susa marked the symbolic climax of Ashurbanipal's campaign and the end of over 2 millennia of Elamite independence. The ancient capital that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties, that had housed the treasures looted from Babylon by Shutruk-Nahhunte, and that had served as the cultural and political center of Elamite civilization, was subjected to deliberate and systematic destruction that exceeded anything previously seen in ancient warfare. Ashurbanipal's forces not only captured the city, but dismantled it stone by stone in a process that took months to complete. The cultural destruction that accompanied the fall of Susa represented one of the greatest losses of ancient artistic and intellectual heritage in recorded history. The royal libraries, temple archives, artistic workshops, and ceremonial centers that had preserved and transmitted Elamite culture for centuries were systematically destroyed or transported to Assyrian territories. The removal of sacred objects, royal regalia, and cultural symbols was designed not just to demonstrate Assyrian victory, but to eliminate the spiritual and cultural foundations that might support future Elamite revival. The fate of Teuman and other captured Elamite leaders revealed the personal vindictiveness that motivated Ashurbanipal's approach to conquest, rather than the relatively honorable treatment that previous Assyrian rulers had typically accorded defeated enemies. Ashurbanipal subjected captured Elamite nobles to public humiliation and brutal execution designed to demonstrate the consequences of opposing Assyrian authority. These displays of cruelty served both as propaganda for Assyrian power and as warnings to other potential enemies throughout the empire. The systematic deportation programs that Ashurbanipal implemented in conquered Elamite territories represented perhaps the most comprehensive attempt at ethnic cleansing in ancient history. Entire populations were forcibly relocated to distant parts of the Assyrian Empire, while foreign colonists were settled in their place. This demographic engineering was designed to eliminate the human foundations that might support future Elamite political revival, while providing the empire with skilled laborers and craftsmen whose expertise could benefit Assyrian economic development. The environmental destruction that resulted from Ashurbanipal's campaigns created ecological damage that would influence regional development for centuries. The systematic destruction of irrigation systems, deforestation for military and construction purposes, and disruption of traditional agricultural practices reduced the carrying capacity of former Elamite territories while creating desert conditions in areas that had previously supported substantial populations. This environmental warfare represented a form of destruction that went beyond immediate military objectives to eliminate the natural foundations for future recovery. The administrative measures that Ashurbanipal implemented for governing conquered Elamite territories demonstrated his determination to prevent any possibility of political revival. Traditional Elamite governmental structures were not merely replaced but systematically eliminated, while new administrative systems were designed to integrate former Elamite territories so completely into the Assyrian Empire that separate political identity would become impossible. These policies represented unprecedented thoroughness in imperial integration that established new standards for conquest administration. The resistance that continued even after the fall of Susa revealed both the persistence of Elamite determination and the limitations of even the most systematic conquest policies. Highland communities that had escaped initial Assyrian attention maintained guerrilla operations that required ongoing military commitments, while surviving Elamite leaders attempted to organize revival movements from refugees in remote mountain regions. However, these resistance efforts lacked the resources and coordination necessary for effective opposition to comprehensive Assyrian control. The propaganda celebration of Ashurbanipal's victories established new precedents for imperial self-presentation that influenced royal ideology throughout the ancient Near East. The systematic documentation of Elamite destruction through royal inscriptions, artistic reliefs, and ceremonial displays created permanent records of Assyrian achievement while serving as warnings to other potential enemies. These propaganda efforts emphasized not just military victory, but cultural superiority and divine approval for Assyrian imperial mission. The economic exploitation of conquered Elamite territories provided Assyrian imperial finances with resources that funded continued expansion while demonstrating the material benefits that successful conquest could provide. The wealth extracted from Elamite territories through systematic looting, tribute collection, and productive integration helped offset the enormous costs that Ashurbanipal's campaigns had required, while providing resources for future military operations against other remaining independent powers. The diplomatic consequences of Elamite destruction reverberated throughout the ancient Near East as other powers adjusted their policies to reflect the new reality of unchallenged Assyrian dominance. Kings and city-states that had previously maintained independence through careful balance between competing powers now faced choices between submission and destruction. while the elimination of Elamite military capabilities removed one of the few remaining sources of effective resistance to Assyrian expansion. By 639 BCE, when Ashurbanipal's active campaigns were ending, the transformation of the ancient Near Eastern political landscape was complete. The Elamite civilization that had survived and often thrived for over 2.5 millennia had been systematically destroyed beyond any possibility of independent revival. The highland territories that had once supported sophisticated urban centers and complex political confederations were reduced to impoverished provincial districts under direct Assyrian administration. The success of Ashurbanipal's vengeance had eliminated one of the last major sources of resistance to Assyrian imperial expansion while establishing new precedents for the thoroughness with which conquest could be pursued. However, the enormous resources that complete Elamite destruction had required would soon create their own problems for Assyrian imperial stability, as the overextension that made such comprehensive conquest possible would ultimately contribute to the empire's own vulnerability to new threats emerging from unexpected directions. In the decades following Ashurbanipal's systematic destruction of Elamite independence, the shattered remnants of what had once been one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations faced a future that seemed to offer only the stark choice between complete disappearance and gradual absorption into whatever new political order might emerge from the ruins of the old. Yet within the highland territories of Fars, where Elamite cultural traditions had their deepest roots and where Assyrian administrative control proved most difficult to maintain, new political developments were beginning that would ultimately transform not just the fate of former Elamite territories, but the entire structure of ancient Near Eastern civilization. The Persian tribes that inhabited the mountainous regions of Fars had been marginal players in regional politics for centuries, mentioned occasionally in Assyrian and Elamite records as pastoral peoples who paid irregular tribute to whatever power controlled the lowland territories, but who otherwise remained largely independent of imperial authority. However, the comprehensive destruction of Elamite political structures had created a power vacuum in precisely those highland areas where Persian tribal confederations were strongest, while Assyrian overextension had left imperial forces unable to exercise effective control over remote mountain territories. The gradual emergence of Persian political authority in former Elamite territories was not the result of dramatic conquest or systematic expansion, but rather a slow process of political evolution that took advantage of changing circumstances to fill administrative and military roles that Assyrian authorities could not manage effectively from their distant centers of power. Persian tribal leaders began assuming responsibilities for local governance, dispute resolution, and defense coordination that imperial administrators were either unwilling or unable to perform, creating de facto Persian authority that gradually became recognized as legitimate by local populations. This transition from Elamite to Persian political control was facilitated by significant cultural continuities that made Persian rule more acceptable to surviving Elamite populations than foreign domination by distant imperial powers. Both Persian and Elamite peoples shared Indo-Iranian cultural backgrounds that included similar religious traditions, social organizations, and approaches to political authority. The highland lifestyle that characterized Persian tribal society was familiar to Elamite mountain communities, while Persian respect for local customs and traditional practices contrasted favorably with the cultural destruction that Assyrian rule had imposed. The religious synthesis that developed during this transitional period created new forms of spiritual practice that combined Persian tribal traditions with surviving elements of Elamite religious culture. The Zoroastrian religious traditions that were emerging among Persian communities proved compatible with many Elamite spiritual practices, particularly those associated with mountain worship and agricultural fertility rituals. This religious compatibility facilitated political integration while preserving important elements of Elamite cultural identity within new Persian frameworks. Teispes, one of the earliest Persian rulers whose name appears in historical records, established the precedents for Persian governance that would characterize the transitional period. Unlike Assyrian administrators who attempted to impose uniform imperial procedures throughout their territories, Teispes and his successors developed flexible approaches to governance that accommodated local traditions while gradually integrating former Elamite territories into expanding Persian political networks. This adaptive approach proved remarkably effective in gaining acceptance from populations who had experienced the destructive consequences of more rigid imperial policies. The economic revival that began under early Persian leadership demonstrated the advantages of political systems that worked with local conditions rather than attempting to impose external standards. Persian rulers encouraged the restoration of irrigation systems, the revival of craft production, and the re-establishment of commercial networks that had been disrupted by Assyrian conquest. More importantly, they allowed former Elamite communities to rebuild their economic foundations according to traditional patterns, while providing coordination and protection that individual communities could not achieve independently. Cyrus I, who succeeded Teispes around 640 BCE, accelerated the process of political integration while maintaining the tolerant policies that had made Persian rule acceptable to diverse populations throughout the region. Under his leadership, Persian authority expanded beyond the immediate Fars region to encompass much of the territory that had traditionally been considered part of the Elamite heartland. This expansion was achieved primarily through diplomatic negotiation and voluntary submission rather than military conquest, reflecting Persian understanding that coerced obedience was less stable than cooperative relationships. The administrative innovations that emerged during Cyrus I's reign established institutional foundations for the remarkably successful imperial system that his descendants would eventually create. Persian governmental practices combined traditional tribal consultation procedures with administrative techniques borrowed from various sources, including surviving Elamite traditions, Mesopotamian imperial precedents, and original Persian innovations. The resulting synthesis proved capable of governing diverse populations across vast territories while maintaining local autonomy and cultural distinctiveness. Cambyses I, who continued Persian expansion during the early 6th century BCE, faced the challenge of maintaining effective governance while extending Persian authority over increasingly diverse populations and territories. His reign marked the transition from tribal confederation to true monarchical authority as Persian political institutions evolved to meet the demands of governing territories that extended far beyond traditional tribal boundaries. The success of this political evolution demonstrated Persian adaptability while preserving essential elements of the tribal traditions that had made Persian rule distinctive. The military developments that characterized early Persian expansion revealed important continuities with Elamite military traditions that had been preserved and adapted by highland communities during the period of Assyrian domination. Persian armies combined traditional highland warfare techniques with organizational innovations that improved their effectiveness in larger-scale operations. The mobility, tactical flexibility, and knowledge of mountain terrain that had characterized Elamite military capabilities were integrated into Persian military culture while being supplemented by new weapons technologies and command procedures. The cultural policies that Persian rulers developed for governing former Elamite territories established precedents for the tolerant imperialism that would become characteristic of the Persian Empire under later rulers. Rather than attempting to eliminate local traditions or impose Persian cultural uniformity, early Persian leaders encouraged cultural diversity while promoting shared loyalty to Persian political authority. This approach proved particularly effective in former Elamite territories where populations had learned to value cultural preservation through their experiences with more destructive forms of imperial rule. The artistic and architectural developments that emerged during the transitional period revealed creative syntheses of Persian and Elamite cultural traditions that would influence the development of Persian imperial culture for centuries. Persian royal art incorporated decorative motifs, ceremonial practices, and symbolic systems derived from Elamite traditions while adapting them to serve Persian political and religious purposes. The result was a distinctive artistic tradition that demonstrated both cultural continuity and political innovation. The commercial networks that Persian rulers established for connecting their expanding territories with broader regional trade systems drew heavily on Elamite commercial expertise and traditional trade relationships. Former Elamite merchants and craft specialists provided knowledge of markets, transportation routes, and production techniques that proved essential for Persian economic development. This commercial integration demonstrated Persian practical wisdom in utilizing local expertise while creating new opportunities for economic prosperity. The diplomatic relationships that early Persian rulers developed with surviving Assyrian authorities and other regional powers revealed sophisticated understanding of international politics that would become characteristic of later Persian imperial policy. Persian leaders learned to balance cooperation and competition with various neighbors, while gradually expanding their influence through methods that avoided provocative direct confrontation. This diplomatic sophistication helped Persian expansion proceed without triggering the kind of coordinated opposition that had characterized resistance to earlier imperial powers. Cyrus the Great, who assumed Persian leadership around 559 BCE, inherited political institutions and cultural traditions that had been refined through decades of gradual development and territorial integration. The Persian kingdom that he commanded combined traditional tribal military capabilities with administrative sophistication that had been learned through governing diverse populations, diplomatic experience gained through managing complex international relationships, and cultural confidence that derived from successful synthesis of various regional traditions. The strategic position that Persian expansion had achieved by the mid-6th century BCE made further imperial development almost inevitable. Persian control over the Iranian highlands provided defensible territorial bases and access to mineral resources that supported military expansion, while Persian administrative capabilities had proven adequate for governing the diverse populations that conquest would bring under their authority. Most importantly, Persian cultural policies had demonstrated that imperial expansion could be achieved without destroying local traditions or provoking desperate resistance. The relationship between Persian expansion and Elamite cultural survival was complex and multifaceted, involving both preservation and transformation of traditional practices within new political frameworks. While independent Elamite political authority had been permanently eliminated, many essential elements of Elamite civilization continued to influence regional development through their integration into Persian imperial culture. The administrative expertise, religious traditions, artistic achievements, and commercial knowledge that Elamite civilization had developed over 2.5 millennia became part of the foundation upon which Persian imperial success was built. By 539 BCE, when Cyrus the Great was preparing for the conquest of Babylon that would establish Persian authority over much of the ancient Near East, the transformation of former Elamite territories was essentially complete. The highland regions that had once supported independent Elamite kingdoms had become integral parts of an expanding Persian Empire, while former Elamite populations had been successfully integrated into Persian political and cultural systems without losing all connection to their distinctive heritage. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon in 539 BCE, proclaiming himself King of Kings and liberator of oppressed peoples, the political entity known as the Elamite Empire had already ceased to exist for over a century. Yet, in a profound historical irony, this moment of Persian triumph also marked the beginning of Elamite immortality. The cultural traditions, administrative expertise, and spiritual practices that had defined Elamite civilization for over 2.5 millennia would not disappear with political independence, but would instead become integral components of the largest empire the ancient world had ever known, ensuring Elamite influence over human development for centuries to come. The integration of former Elamite territories into Cyrus's expanding Persian Empire proceeded according to the tolerant principles that had characterized Persian rule in the highlands since the collapse of Assyrian power. Rather than treating these regions as conquered territories to be exploited or transformed, Persian administrators recognized them as core provinces whose populations possessed valuable expertise and cultural traditions that could strengthen imperial capabilities. The ancient city of Susa, despite the devastation inflicted by Ashurbanipal's forces, was rebuilt and elevated to serve as one of the primary administrative capitals of the Persian Empire, a status that demonstrated Persian appreciation for Elamite governmental traditions. The administrative integration that followed Persian conquest revealed the extent to which Elamite institutional knowledge had survived the political catastrophes of the 7th century BCE. Persian imperial administration adopted numerous Elamite practices, including multilingual record-keeping systems, diplomatic protocols for managing relationships with diverse subject populations, and legal procedures that accommodated cultural differences within unified governmental frameworks. The Elamite language itself continued to serve important administrative functions within the Persian Empire, appearing alongside Persian and Akkadian in royal inscriptions and official documents for over 2 centuries. The religious synthesis that emerged within the Persian Empire incorporated many Elamite spiritual traditions into the Zoroastrian framework that provided ideological unity for Persian imperial rule. Elamite deities were not eliminated but rather reinterpreted as manifestations or servants of Ahura Mazda, while Elamite ritual practices were adapted to serve Persian ceremonial purposes. The fire temples that became characteristic features of Persian religious architecture drew on Elamite traditions of mountain worship and sacred flame maintenance that had been central to highland spiritual practices for millennia. The artistic and architectural legacy of Elamite civilization achieved its most visible expression in the magnificent ceremonial complex that Persian rulers constructed at Persepolis during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. The architectural principles, decorative motifs, and ceremonial programs that characterized this great palace drew heavily on traditions that had been developed at Elamite royal centers over many centuries. The famous relief sculptures that depicted representatives from throughout the Persian Empire bringing tribute to the King of Kings included figures wearing distinctively Elamite costumes and carrying objects that reflected traditional Elamite craft specializations. The technological and craft knowledge that Elamite artisans had accumulated over centuries of innovation continued to influence Persian imperial culture in numerous practical ways. Elamite metallurgical techniques contributed to Persian weapons production and luxury craft manufacture, while Elamite agricultural methods influenced Persian approaches to highland farming and irrigation management. The commercial networks that had connected Elamite territories with markets throughout Asia were expanded and systematized under Persian rule, creating trade relationships that would persist for centuries. The linguistic influence of Elamite civilization extended far beyond administrative convenience to shape fundamental aspects of Persian cultural development. Many Persian royal titles, ceremonial terms, and administrative vocabularies derived from Elamite sources, while Elamite grammatical structures and literary conventions influenced Persian approaches to formal writing and official communication. The preservation of Elamite linguistic traditions within Persian imperial culture ensured that essential elements of Elamite intellectual heritage would survive long after political independence had been lost. The educational and intellectual traditions that Persian imperial administration required drew heavily on scholarly practices that had been developed in Elamite royal courts and temple complexes. Persian scribal schools taught Elamite writing systems alongside Persian and Akkadian, while Persian legal education included study of Elamite legal precedents and judicial procedures. The diplomatic training that prepared Persian officials for service throughout the empire emphasized Elamite approaches to intercultural communication and conflict resolution that had proven effective in governing diverse populations. During the Seleucid period that followed Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire, many Elamite cultural elements persisted within the Hellenistic kingdoms that controlled former Persian territories. Greek and Macedonian rulers found Elamite administrative practices useful for governing their eastern territories, while Elamite religious traditions continued to influence popular spiritual practices throughout the Iranian highlands. However, the political fragmentation that characterized the Hellenistic period reduced the institutional support that had preserved Elamite traditions within unified imperial frameworks. The Parthian and Sasanian empires that subsequently controlled Iranian territories maintained some connections to Elamite cultural heritage, But these relationships became increasingly tenuous as time passed and new cultural influences accumulated. By the early centuries of the Common Era, distinctively, Elamite practices had largely merged into broader Iranian cultural traditions, while the Elamite language had ceased to function as a vehicle for literary or administrative communication. The political memory of independent Elamite civilization gradually faded as new dynasties created their own historical narratives that emphasized different cultural precedents. The Arab conquest of Iran in the 7th century CE marked the final transformation of the cultural landscape that had preserved Elamite traditions for over a millennium. Islamic civilization brought new languages, religious practices, and social institutions that replaced many of the Persian and pre-Persian traditions that had maintained connections to Elamite heritage. While some elements of ancient Iranian culture persisted within Islamic frameworks, the specifically Elamite components of this heritage became increasingly difficult to identify or trace. The complete disappearance of Elamite civilization from historical memory occurred gradually over many centuries as successive waves of cultural change eliminated the institutional and intellectual frameworks that had preserved knowledge of ancient traditions. Medieval Persian and Arabic historians occasionally mentioned ancient kingdoms in the Iranian highlands, but they lacked access to sources that could provide accurate information about Elamite history or achievements. The physical remains of Elamite cities were gradually buried by natural processes or incorporated into later construction projects that obscured their original purposes and significance. The rediscovery of Elamite civilization began in the 19th century when European archaeological expeditions started systematic excavation of ancient sites in Iran and Mesopotamia. The decipherment of cuneiform writing systems revealed the existence of an Elamite language and provided access to thousands of documents that had preserved records of Elamite political, economic, and cultural activities. French excavations at Susa, beginning in 1884, uncovered spectacular architectural remains and artistic treasures that demonstrated the sophistication of Elamite material culture. The 20th century witnessed dramatic expansion in scholarly understanding of Elamite civilization as improved archaeological techniques, linguistic analysis, and historical synthesis revealed the scope and significance of Elamite achievements. The discovery of major Elamite sites like Choga Zanbil provided new insights into Elamite religious practices and architectural capabilities, while the recovery of royal archives containing thousands of administrative documents illuminated the complexity of Elamite governmental institutions and economic systems. Modern scholarship has revealed that Elamite civilization made fundamental contributions to human development that influenced the evolution of writing systems, legal codes, administrative practices, and artistic traditions throughout the ancient world. The Elamite approach to governing diverse populations within flexible political frameworks anticipated many features of modern pluralistic societies, while Elamite innovations in metallurgy, agriculture, and commercial organization contributed to technological developments that shaped human material culture for millennia. The contemporary relevance of Elamite history extends beyond academic interest to provide important perspectives on cultural survival, political adaptation, and the complex relationships between imperial expansion and local identity. The Elamite experience demonstrates that civilizations can persist and influence human development even after their political independence has been eliminated, while also illustrating the importance of cultural tolerance and institutional flexibility for long-term social stability. The question that opened our exploration, how a civilization that endured for over 2.5 millennia could become so thoroughly forgotten, finds its answer in the very adaptability that enabled Elamite survival. By successfully integrating into successive imperial systems rather than maintaining rigid independence, Elamite culture preserved its essential elements while gradually losing its distinctive political identity. This process of survival through transformation ensured that Elamite contributions to human civilization would persist long after the Elamite name had been forgotten. The legacy of the Elamite Empire ultimately transcends the boundaries of any single civilization or historical period. In their remarkable journey from the dawn of urban life to absorption into the Persian Empire, The Elamites demonstrated that human societies possess extraordinary capabilities for adaptation, innovation, and persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Their story reminds us that the apparent disappearance of civilizations may conceal deeper continuities that connect ancient achievements to modern developments in ways that only careful historical investigation can reveal. In bringing the Elamites out of historical obscurity, we recover not just knowledge of a forgotten empire, but understanding of the complex processes through which human societies create, preserve, and transmit the cultural achievements that make civilization possible. The Elamite legacy lives on in countless ways that we are only beginning to understand, ensuring that this ancient people's contributions to human development will continue to influence our world for generations to come.